Hello. Today I will be decorating my level and listening to some videos. This one we haven't finished yesterday, so let's do it.
To make of that, I should ask Jonathan Pajot, because I suspect he'd have something to say about that.
Yeah.
I think that the one way of interpreting the account of the fall is that it was the inevitable consequence of Adam and Eve's overreach.
Sure.
And so they end up banished, not so much because God wants them out of the garden, but because in their pride, they threw themselves out of the garden in their overreach. And I wrote about this. It's very hard for me to generate the entire interpretation on the fly. I wrote about this extensively in this new book that I'm publishing in November, trying to take apart that particular issue. Because what seems to happen in the Adam and Eve account is that you have an allusion to the function of male and female consciousness. First, you have Adam, who names and subdues and orders, right? And so he's an extension in some ways of the Logos, right, in human form. And God's curious enough about that to bring everything to Adam to just see what he'll name.
Yeah.
But the command is for Adam to put everything in its proper place in this hierarchical organization with its proper name. And Adam can do that if he's an adequate and faithful reflection of the Logos. Then Eve is created as the counterpart to that. And it's something like, well, there's an ordering tendency and there's the order that produces. But then there are things that are on the margin that aren't accounted for by the divine order, and they need a voice. And Eve is the voice of, you think about this biologically, what does a woman do in the context of a family? She brings the attention to that which is vulnerable and has not yet been properly incorporated. So,
well, what do you mean by that?
Well, imagine that you have a well-constituted family and there's a new baby. Well, the baby doesn't fit in. The baby is an anomaly. The baby is an individual that has its own idiosyncrasies. Yeah. And the mother, who's sensitive to the needs of the infant, she's going to be the voice of that. She's going to knock on the door of the ordering principle and say, you need to make some adjustments here so that what can't fit does.
It feels, because, yeah, and again, I'm trying to understand what you're saying and trying to be charitable. It does seem to me that this is an unnatural interpolation in that sort of. It seems like maybe it's too much. Like I don't know if that's because you can make that work, right? You can make that work, but
there's always this is the kind of objection that Sam Harris had to the sorts of things that I said. He said, "Well, you can interpret a cookbook that way."
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and this is a huge problem. This is the problem that postmodernists dangled in front of everyone. It's like, well, what's the canonical interpretation of a text? The answer is no one knows.
Yeah.
Right, and so does that mean that there's an infinite number of interpretations per text? Yes. Which one's correct? Hey. Now, that problem, I think, to some degree, has actually been technically solved. Well, the large language models do this.
Okay.
You bet.
Right.
So I've been talking to one of my colleagues about a new discipline, which is something like computational epistemology. Well, because the large language models track patterns of interrelationships between words. Okay, so when you're trying to interpret something like the story of Adam and Eve, the story is the words, the story is the letters, the story is the words, the story is the phrases, the story is the sentences, and the paragraphs, and the chapters, and the whole biblical corpus, plus the entire bloody culture. And all of that bears on those interpretations. So you say, well, am I overreaching my interpretation in relationship to Adam and Eve? And I would say, well, that's a very difficult question. And it's possible to overreach and it's possible to overinterpret.
I mean, specifically with the female in the family.
Well, the thing is, though, that there
I mean, could any other person, like having not listened to this conversation and not spoken to you,
Taoists would know that.
But any other person in the world sort of read the story of Adam and Eve and similarly say, well, I think that this is because Eve is representing what a woman does in a well-oriented family, which has to do with, when you have a child, it's sort of it's an anomaly, it's something new, and it's the woman that brings
well,
that.
That's Eve. Eve stands for the voice of the serpent. Right?
Yeah.
The thing that's excluded.
That's true, but
yeah, but that's exactly the point. Is that's exactly. So would someone else come to that conclusion? I would say, well, people can make that decision for themselves when they read the text, but I would say it's very much in keeping, let's say, with Taoist interpretations of what masculine and feminine are.
It's not an infallible way to understand whether an interpretation is correct, but I think it's helpful to know if you read a novel, there's that sort of joke that school children make about, like, it doesn't matter what a novel says, it'll be like the curtains were blue, and the English teacher will say, well, let's unpack that, let's look at what that means.
Yeah.
Right, and people make fun of that because that's their experience in school.
Yeah.
I think that one way to understand if we're doing this appropriately is if two people simultaneously think, oh, actually, the fact that the curtains were blue is significant here if you consider this. So it seems to point to that. If people can independently, even if they don't get it quite the same, recognize that that's significant.
Yeah, well,
right?
certainly.
It's helpful to understand that there's something.
Yes, definitely.
There's something legitimate about that kind of analogy.
Definitely. This is actually part of the reason that I became so interested in the Jungian Iliad, Erich Neumann's school of mythological interpretation, because that's exactly what they did. Was they took patterns of interpretation, let's say of masculine and feminine, from multiple cultures and looked for overlap.
Yeah.
Okay, when I wrote Maps of Meaning, so I did that. I used the Jungian works in that regard, but I also used what I knew about neuropsychology and neuropsychopharmacology, with the presumption being that if all of these pointers pointed to the same thing, it was probably there. That's multi-method, multi-trait construct validation fundamentally. And the notion is that your senses do the same thing. If your eyes and your ears and your sense of smell and your taste and your touch all report the same thing, then you have a reasonable probability of surviving if you assume that it's true. Now, that's not perfect, because the reason we talk is that I don't want to just rely on my own senses, even though there's 5 of them. So I've got a quintangulation happening, which is a pretty decent way of specifying truth. I want to know if your perception shows concordance, right?
Sure.
We want this converging evidence. Now, it's trickier with textual interpretation. Partly it's trickier too, because mere consensus is not sufficient. You need deep expertise. Okay, so why would I say that? Well, we have these large language models, for example, and they're doing statistical analysis of textual interrelationship at every level, right? Billions of parameters. So the letter conjunctions, the word conjunctions, the phrase conjunctions, the sentence conjunctions, the whole bloody thing. But even they're prone to go astray. And the reason for that is that they're overweighted to the present. So we have the alignment problem as a consequence, which is, well, how do we trust the AI interpretations? Well, the same problem obtains for human beings, the alignment problem. How do we align ourselves? Well, that's what a classical education did. Right, and that was steeping in the ancient texts. Why? Because the ancient texts are distillations of patterns that have existed over thousands of years. And if you know the patterns, you orient yourself properly. And that also makes you immune to... See, the problem with the convergence notion is it can produce a false consensus. Like all the Nazis agreed.
Yeah.
Well, that's a problem, because they were wrong.
Do you think we should be sending ChatGPT to Bible school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have a colleague, we've been training AI systems on classic texts. They're way more useful.
Yeah.
I use one all the time. We haven't released it.
How is it more useful? Do you
It's not woke. Seriously, it's not ideologically addled.
Right, but surely it is. It's ideologically. It's ideologically controlled and confined, just in a different way.
No, I don't think it's ideologically confined.
An ideology
typical postmodern.
Ideology doesn't need to be bad, especially given that, like, as a non-believer in Christianity, I see Christianity as an ideology, right?
That's a good objection. This goes back to the point that you made. This goes back to the point you made about people taking the right to themselves to define the moral order, let's say, in the Garden of Eden. Okay, so what's the problem with that? The problem is that the proper interpretation is bounded by the actuality of the cosmic order, right? So it isn't the postmodernists say, well, it's just one ideology. It's either this one or this one. But then that's all grounded in power, as it turns out. So they've got something at the bloody pinnacle anyways. That philosophy either degenerates into a kind of incoherent nihilism or it turns into a power play. It's like, no, there are canonical interpretations. Well, what are they? Well, that's what's encapsulated in the religious text is canonical interpretations. Okay, why are they canonical? Okay, I'll give you an example. You tell me what you think about this. This is a good rejoinder to Dawkins' selfish gene.
Right.
Okay, so God is conceptualized in the story of Abraham as the call to adventure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Abraham is privileged. He's rich. He's in a state of infantile security. He doesn't have to do a damn thing till he's like 70. He has rich parents. He doesn't have to lift a finger. Okay, and then a voice comes to him that says, get the hell away from your zone of comfort. Leave your family, leave your tent, leave your community. Go out in the world. Okay, well, so what is that? Well, that's the same impulse that drives a child to develop. It's the impulse that drives a man to continue to mature, right? So you can think about it as an instinct if you want, the instinct to growth. Okay, God makes Abraham a deal. It's such a stellar deal. He says, look, if you listen to this voice of adventure, if you commit to it, if you live by its dictates, and you make the proper sacrifices along the way, this is what will happen to you. You'll be a blessing to yourself. Okay, so that's a good deal. That's a nice start, right? So you don't have to be miserable and self-conscious, right? Aware of your own nakedness. You can start to walk with God again. Okay, but more, you'll do that in a way that will ensure your valid reputation. So that's a good deal because you want to have a reputation that's distributed in the social community, obviously. And if it's based on something real, so much the better. Then you're not a charlatan or a fake or a psychopath. Okay, but that's not all. He says, you'll do that in a way that will enable you to establish a permanent dynasty that will cascade down the generations. And that's not all either. You'll do all that in a way that's beneficial to everyone else. So this is so cool because it speaks of, it's something like the tree of life. It speaks of a concordance, right, between the instinct to mature and develop, that calling of adventure, the pathway that actually works best for you, the pathway that works best for you and establishes something permanent in a manner that enhances your reputation, that cascades down the generations. Okay, now Abraham is offered, if he follows this pathway, God says, well, you'll be the father of nations. Okay, so now imagine this. This is contra the selfish gene, let's say. The human pattern of reproduction. Dawkins' mistake was that he thought reproduction and sex were the same thing. And they're not. They're not, especially not in the human case, because human beings are high investment, long-term maters, right?
Sure.
So we have very few offspring and we invest like mad in them. Pair bond, you live long enough to be grandparents, you put okay, so that means that to be the proper father, you have to act out a sacrificial ethos. Okay, the idea in the story of Abraham is that if you act out that sacrificial ethos properly, which aligns the spirit of adventure with the harmony of the community, you will act in a manner that best ensures the long-term survival of your offspring, right? So you can imagine it's not just the contribution of sperm to egg, it's the development of an ethos of paternal care that increases the probability that your children will be successful, but also in a way that increases the probability that their children will be successful. All right, so that's an alignment with a genuine cosmic order. It's not arbitrary. And so there are interpretations, we'll say, they're not just ideologies. They're not just arbitrary interpretations of the way the world lays itself out. They are in harmony with the cosmic order. And that's what makes them deep, sacred, fundamental, and in the truest possible sense. That is the proper rejoinder to the postmodernists. It's like, see, this is why they insist. This is why they're so anti-science in their ethos too. And this is where Sam Harris has got a point, because Harris likes to make a case for objective morality. Objective. It's like transcendent is the right word, not objective.
But did it actually happen? I'm kidding. What I was really interested thinking about that, and I just had 3 hours with Sam Harris where we sort of went around on that question, and I agree that I think his system fails, essentially, for what it's worth.
He's got a point. He wants to ground morality in something that isn't a mere postmodern illusion. And there's something to be said for that.
I want to know how much, like, the story of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, the story of Abraham, okay, train a large language model on that because it's integrated into the cosmic order, however you want to say it. How far do you go with this? I mean, like, do you train this model on the New Testament?
Know.
Do you train it on the epistles?
We're playing with that. I don't know.
Do you train it on John Milton?
Good question. Dante.
Ovid.
So imagine, that's a very good question. So imagine that at the foundation, you have the biblical library, okay? But then you have, like you said, the secondary literatures.
What about the Quran?
We want to train a separate one on the Quran.
Keep them
and then we want to have them debate. Well, what's really interesting in the case of Islam, because there's an insistence in the Islamic world that the entire epistemology is actually contained in the text and nothing else.
I think the mistake that people make in comparative religion between Islam and Christianity is that they think that the Bible in Christianity is what the Quran is in Islam.
Right. That's just not the case.
In Islam, the word becomes a book, and in Christianity, the word becomes a person. I think Jesus is to Christianity what the Quran is to Islam, right?
Absolutely.
And that's probably
that's a big difference.
I think that's a mistake that people make, partly because, I mean, the Quran is infallible.
Right.
You can't think that any word of the Quran is wrong because it's the literal and altered word of God. Whereas with the Bible, you've got a bit more leeway, say it's mythology, or maybe there's a historical contradiction, but it's not actually that much of a problem. However, if you had Jesus in front of you, you can't contradict him, right? I think that's an important distinction for people to keep in mind.
That also makes the logos the living word.
Yeah,
right. Which is very important.
It makes it more difficult to put forward the somewhat naive criticism that I think people often make of the Gospels as contradicting each other, because again, like we're talking like historically here, was Herod on the throne at the same time Quirinius was the governor of Syria as Luke says? And it's sort of like, in a sense, who cares? I mean, one of the points that my friend John Nelson has made brilliantly is, have you ever come across the concept of the what do they call it, the Churchillian drift, where a bunch of quotes that Churchill never said just get attributed to him. I find that
that's
the best
part of
breakfast is
that's part of the pattern of mythologization.
If someone says, I think
they fall into his orbit because they're of his type.
I think the best breakfast in the morning is a glass of champagne, a hearty glass of champagne, right? He never said that, but people sort of think maybe he said that.
Sounds like something Churchill might have said.
Same thing happens with C.S. Lewis. Now, the point that my friend John pointed out to me was that, well, if all you had, the only information you had about Winston Churchill was a book of apocryphal quotes that people had attributed to him and agreed that he'd said, you'd still probably get a pretty good idea about who Winston Churchill was.
It might be easy to just toss all of your discipline to the side for the summer. That's hallow.com/Jordan.
And that's something you can do with the Bible.
Well, that's partly because
or the Gospels.
You put something. You see, let's say that there's a shape, there's a three-dimensional shape on the wall, and you want to. The wall's like flat white, so you can't really see it. So what you want to do is you want to throw a bunch of like garbage at the wall, so to speak, and the outline. Despite the fact that everything you throw at the wall is garbage and it lands in many different places, if you throw enough of it at the wall, you'll get the shape. Well, it's partly because you can imagine that there's a set of sayings that have been misremembered, but a fairly comprehensive set. You're still going to be able to extract signal. Right? There's going to be noise, but there's going to be signal there. That's partly because the truth will be encoded in the panoply of the...
That's why it's a bigger problem if somebody points out like some flat historical... if there was discovered just like a flat historical contradiction in the Quran, that'd be a big problem because the Quran is the literal word of God. If someone points out a flat historical contradiction in the Gospels, it kind of doesn't matter as much because you're able to accept that maybe that is just a contradiction, but the thing that matters is the word of God, and the word of God is not the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of John, but the person that they were sort of writing about.
Well, that's also partly, you see, that you just pointed to another reason why I don't like the over-concretized questions. It's like, you're looking for truth in the wrong place there, buddy.
I understand that, but it also depends on what kind of truth you're looking for, right? Because for me,
Yes,
as an
that's
interested
for sure.
third party,
Everything depends on that.
I'd really like to know if Jesus actually rose from the dead as a historical fact. I'd love to know if there was a real Exodus. You know, that's really
Yeah.
interesting and important to me. Now,
Yeah.
as somebody who doesn't believe that those things did happen, I still have access to the meaning of the story of something like a resurrection.
Well, let's assume, just for the sake
But
of
I'm not a Christian. It's not enough for me to say, well, you know, do I believe that, you know, self-sacrifice is at the basis of a meaningful life? Oh, maybe, but that's not enough to make me a Christian, because I don't believe it's the case. I'm quite interested, actually, how, I mean, you're obviously quite attracted to Christianity and the Christian story. I mean,
Yeah, well, I think
Jesus
it's
on
true.
your jacket, but I'm interested how that dovetails with your insistence on personal responsibility as the way to live a proper and meaningful life, given that the story of Jesus is one of vicarious redemption. I sort of throw my sins on him, you know. He takes responsibility for the sins that I've committed.
Yeah, well, I
wonder how those go together.
What would you say?
No, Jesus.
Look,
Jesus
it's really good.
Clean up
It's
your room
really
for
good
you,
to
you know?
have a divine ally.
Mm.
And I think the more unerringly you aim upward, the more you walk with God.
Mhm.
And that does mean that Christ is beside you.
Mhm.
And so that is a reflection of the truth of vicarious redemption. But that doesn't mean you have nothing to do.
Mm.
Right. And Christ makes that very clear in the Gospels. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, right? Only those who do the will of my Father.
You must be willing to hate your brother and your
Well,
father.
there's a tension there, because the vicarious redemption idea is a reflection of the mercy of God. It's like if you, and I believe this to be the case, as I said, if your aim is upward, then God is your ally, right? And so he's there with you, bearing the cross, but you're still obliged to carry it, right? And you see that in the story too. That's embedded in the Passion story, because there's an insistence in traditional Christianity that the suffering and the death that a man would experience in that situation were real, despite the fact that God was also experiencing it, right? So there's this duality. And I think that's reflected in the idea of vicarious redemption when it's understood properly. It's like, yes, you'll have, here's another way of thinking about it, is that if you aim upward unerringly, you have the spirit of what's good. What are you saying? You've established a relationship with the spirit of what's the highest good. Well, then that's with you. And that's not just a reality. It's like the ultimate reality. It's partly, it's Nietzsche even alluded to that when he said, if you have a why, you can bear any how.
Yeah.
Well, what why? Well, the ultimate why. Well, what does that enable you to do? To bear the ultimate how. And that's exactly what the Passion story is. And so there is a vicarious redemption there, because if you do it properly, you don't have to do it alone. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing on you. You know, and you see that too. There's an insistence in the entire biblical library that what humans are called to do is real. Like we're made in the image of God. We're participating in the process by which possibility is transformed in order. We're building, as far as I'm concerned, we're either building the city of God or we're building its alternative, right? With the domain of hell. Actually, right? Actually, really, as well as metaphysically.
I mean, it's interesting you say hell and actually in the same sentence, because
well, it's easier to believe in hell than heaven.
Well, one of the other criticisms that I made of you in this video was that I felt like you were appropriating religious language illegitimately to apply a sense of the sacred to profane things, to mundane things. And that's perhaps one example. So I can give you a few examples. I mean, one is implied in what you just said there, but you said it, I think, explicitly to Matt Fradd recently on Pints with Aquinas, where you said, if you have studied any amount of history and you don't believe that hell is real,
right,
then you're an idiot.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, I understand, I think, what you mean by that, because hell, like, you know, hell is a place on earth in many respects, right? Like if you study history and you look at just like what levels of depravity humanity can sink to. Like, and you could quite poetically say, well, if hell isn't the right word to describe that, then I don't know what is.
Right.
Say something like that, right? But clearly, a theological conception of hell does not exist on planet Earth. It's somewhere you go after you die.
It's not so clear. I wouldn't say it's so clear.
Well, certainly not in like the Jewish tradition. And okay,
Dante?
Maybe not in the okay, maybe not. But like, I mean, like a modern Christian who asks you, for example, do you believe in hell? And you know that what they mean.
They mean the place you go after you die.
The place you go after you die. Then when you respond and say, sort of, well, of course hell is real. Well, you don't believe in hell? Have you studied any amount of history? If you know, it's sort of, it feels like you're sort of describing two different things. It's a equivocation. The other area where this largely happens, I think, is when you've said that the very act of doing science.
See, there's a concordance there between that concept of eternal punishment in the afterlife and the hell that unites all totalitarian states. But I don't know what the concordance is. Like I don't understand.
Like do you think
and I don't speculate generally on anything that's, let's say, beyond death. I mean, what the hell can you say about that? I don't have anything to say about that.
But that's another I don't know point, right? So if I ask you, for example, you know, do you think that Hitler is being punished now? You know, I mean, he's dead, but is he being punished, or did he ever get punished?
The answer to that question is something like, what is the relationship between the evanescent consciousness of man and eternity? And the answer is, we don't know.
Yeah, when Matt Fradd asked you, do you believe in an afterlife, you said that something like your behaviors or your actions resonate through eternity.
Yeah, well, there's that, which is, you know, in a way an evasive answer too. But the thing is, we don't understand. We exist in relationship to the infinite, obviously. What that relationship is, no one knows how to conceptualize that in the final analysis. I don't understand the relationship between our binding temporally and eternity. Like, is there something permanent about our conscious experience? I don't know.
I think you excite your Christian listenership when you say, like, not only, you know, do I believe in hell, but you can't not believe in hell. I mean, are you serious? You seriously don't believe in hell? And they think, here's a strong sort of warrior.
Well, and you go, well, the other.
But then they realize that what you mean by hell is just like,
well, it's so
lots of human suffering and catastrophe, you know, on planet Earth.
But it's more than that, you know, because it is the case that the invitation to hell is offered by the eternal usurper of the moral order. That's true. You end up in hell because you lie. That's also true. And so,
but when you say that's true, you end up in hell because you lie.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, the totalitarian state,
you're not allowed to use the word hell, right? Like, what is the thing you're describing? You end up where? In a totalitarian state.
Yes.
And that's fine.
A state of ultimate misery.
But I think this is where somebody might be prone to confusion. And you could say that's their fault, maybe it is. But if somebody's listening to you and do you believe in hell? And you say, of course I believe in hell. How can you not believe in hell? And they go, you know, thank goodness, because that of course is my worldview. I'd love to know how I can defend my vision of hell. And then they realize that when you say hell, what you actually mean is something like totalitarian human regimes.
I guess I mean at least that.
Sure.
Right, and so
fine.
I'm often trying to make a minimal case. Right, if I'm trying to elaborate on the meaning of a religious text. What I'm trying to say in all humility is, it means at least this. Now, does that cover the entire territory of the meaning? That's very unlikely. You're going to give an exhaustive account? I don't think so. What does that mean in eternity? It's the same question, and then we should draw this part to a close. It's the same question in some sense as the reality of the resurrection of Christ. So the Christian interpretation is Christ defeats death and hell. Okay, well, the logical objection to that is, well, where's the evidence for the defeat? Since death still exists, and so does malevolence.
Yeah, sure.
Well, the Christians then will escape, so to speak, into something like a symbolic interpretation and say, well, it's true in eternity. And I think fair enough. Like I do believe that the idea that Christ defeated death and hell is true. But I don't know what that means. And so, and does that bother me? Well, I'd rather know, and I'm continuing to investigate it. But I do know, for example,
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who recently became a Christian, she just had a conversation with Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
It hasn't gone out yet. I was there. I had the privilege of being. So I've already heard it. I know what they spoke about. But one of the things that Ayaan does is, and I've described it as sort of almost comical, the way that Ayaan talks about her struggle with depression, suicidality, total hopelessness, and then finds that by praying she's able to sort of elevate her life. And then cuts to Richard Dawkins, sort of, but do you believe that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth? It was funny. It was I couldn't,
level of analysis problem.
At the same time, I sort of understood it because and Dawkins says, but surely when you go to church and you're having these feelings, Ayaan, you must recognize that the things he's saying at the pulpit are nonsense. And Ayaan said that she chooses to believe it. She says that I no longer find it to be nonsense because what she implied, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, I can't remember, but it was something like, look, I've been so captured by this meaning that although I don't really understand what it means to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, I just choose to believe it.
Well,
now that's fine. But what she does, what I was going to say is what she does is says that this to me is like a mystery. I don't really know exactly what it means, but I choose to believe that it's true. And I wonder if that's something like what you're doing here when you say that you believe it's true.
Well, I can just tell you what my experience has been in this sort of thing. So I've spent a lot of time digging into the substructure of mythological accounts, right, in many different cultures. Now, and my experience continually is the deeper I look, the more that's there. And then I see things come together that make sense that I thought were disparate. And that there doesn't seem to be any limit to that. And so now when I see things that are disparate or even contradictory, I think, well, as you already pointed out, given the nature of the biblical library, there's room for some contradiction. But more than that, I think, well, that might be illogical or irrational, or I might just not understand it. And my experience has been that presumption turns out to be the case far more often than not. And so, you can imagine that you can get the apprehension of a pattern, and you can think the pattern is compelling. And then there are details within the pattern that you don't know how to reconcile. But this is what Ayaan is doing in accordance with your account. It's like, well, I'm not willing to forego my view of the pattern because of some lack of concordance with details, especially given that I'm ignorant. Well, I can only tell you what has been the pattern of my investigations. It's like the more deeply this is knocking and asking, the more I seek, the more is present.
And I guess, to conclude, I suppose, like so suppose I'm somebody, and broadly this is true. I think the gospel stories are fascinating and resonant. I like the idea of the resurrection of Christ. The way that it's criticized as this evil human sacrifice, I think is misleading. I have all of those parts. Right. But I'm not a Christian. And I suppose the question...
In what way are you not?
Well, that's what I mean. To help me understand what you mean by this, what is the difference between someone who's not a Christian and
That's a good question.
They're not some new atheist type. They're not like, I wouldn't worship God even though they're just not a Christian, and someone who is. What's the difference between those two people?
Is like 90% Christian.
That's what people keep saying about him, and I think...
Well, I think partly because I do believe that he is committed to the truth. He does believe that the truth will set you free. He does believe that there's an intelligible order. He believes that the investigation of the intelligible order is redeeming.
This is... It's a shame we don't have a bit more time to do the science thing. Perhaps that will have to be another conversation.
So, who is and who isn't a Christian? That's not an easy question. And that's, again, why I started our conversation.
Well, I think it's inappropriate for you to try to say who is and who isn't, but just abstractly, like, what you think the difference is. Like, what is it that, under what conditions
Christians hoist their cross and walk up a hill.
Right, okay, so I've heard you say that before as well, right?
But that is what I think. That's the difference.
Not to sort of try to be too left-brained about this, but, like, in practice, what do you mean? Or, like, perhaps two sort of symmetrical questions. What conditions under which, what are the conditions under which somebody can say...
How careful are you with your words?
Well, I try to be careful.
Okay, well, that's a good approximation to Christian conduct, right? Because that's worship of the Logos,
Fine, but
right?
I mean,
but that's really a serious part of it.
I don't know if that will be enough. I certainly don't know if the word worship there is particularly appropriate.
How profoundly do you value it?
To the extent that it helps me to convey my ideas properly. I don't worship the words that I'm using themselves.
No,
I don't care
understand
for the
that.
words, but the words are a tool, and the reason that I'm as precise as I can be is in service of trying to communicate my ideas to you.
For what purpose?
So that whatever it is that I'm feeling or thinking in my head, if I could somehow take a medical instrument and prod your brain to make the same thought arise, that would be really helpful to me, because you'd see the world how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
That is what language is. It's that tool, except instead of prodding your brain with a physical bit of metal, I'm prodding your ears with vibrations in the air. But I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm
To what end?
trying to make that thought arise so that you can see the world as I do, and so that I can see the world as you do.
To what end?
Well, I don't know.
Well, how about productive harmonization of
But
vision?
fine, yeah, it depends on the conversation, right? So like in this instance, it will be. I mean, I came into this conversation, I suppose, with a goal to more thoroughly understand your worldview, which is more specific than usually with these conversations. It would be, let's try to learn something from each other and convince each other of something. And in this case, I really was just fascinated to sit down and try to understand, what does Jordan Peterson think about religion? Like, that's probably the goal, which maybe is a slightly inappropriate goal to come into a conversation with, but that's really what I've been trying to understand. So I suppose that's the goal.
So it's the idea. Well, we can wrap this up with let's say a Christian observation is that there's a notion, a classical Christian notion, that wherever two or more are together in Christ's name, the Spirit of God is there.
Yep.
Right? Okay, so what does that mean? Well, as far as I'm concerned, what it means is that if you're unerring in your choice of words, if you're seeking with them and exploring, and I'm doing the same, and then we do that together, that's a mutually redemptive process that spirals upward.
So
And that's a Christian endeavor.
One of the conditions under which somebody can say they're a Christian and be either lying or wrong, and the condition under which someone can say, I'm not a Christian, and be either lying or wrong, if you see what I mean.
That's a very good question. Well, something came to mind right away when you asked that question, like pretty much instantly. It said, the redemptive. There's a reason that Christ is represented as the person who took the sins of the world onto himself. Well, that's the essence. It's like the world is a fallen place, and you have the responsibility to do something about that. And the degree to which you take that responsibility onto yourself, that's the degree to which you are
Christian
follower of Christ.
I suppose
right?
it's not an on and off switch. That was it's unfair to frame it as such. I suppose it's not like you either are an on or off switch. It's not like you're.
Well, I think you want to make a
Christian or you're not.
Well,
it's like you're more or less.
When Jacob decides to be a good person instead of a bad person, he builds an altar, and it signifies his willingness to sacrifice his past self. I think that people decide in many ways, and maybe multiple times, whether they're going to aim up or not. Now, that's that initial commitment. It's like a baptism in a sense, that you decided that you're going to aim up. Okay, well, now you can do that badly, because you will. And you see this in the Old Testament accounts of the prophets all the time. A lot of them are pretty reprehensible when they first find their feet. But you can stumble your way uphill. And that is the essence of Christian belief, is to stumble your way uphill with the maximum load you can bear. And the thing that's so fascinating about that is that that's also the pathway of maximal meaning. And that meaning is exactly what enables you to bear the load. So it's a very paradoxical, what would you say? It's a very paradoxical reality. And I think the essence of the Christian faith is the imitation of Christ. It's not the mouthing of the words. Now, that doesn't mean the words shouldn't be in accordance with the commitment. They should be.
Yeah.
But the commitment can't be reduced to the utterance. The commitment is the carrying.
Yeah.
Right.
As it
And
says
the carrying in relationship to a goal.
in the imitation of Christ.
It's in the imitation.
The text, I mean, the book, the imitation of Christ. You won't be judged on what you say, but what you've done.
Yeah, well, and I don't mean, that also doesn't mean that the treasure that you stack up on earth is an indication of your transcendent value, right? You shouldn't fall into the justification by works heresy.
Right.
But with that coda firmly in mind, I don't think there's anything in that proposition that isn't in accordance with the gospel accounts. Like Christ calls on his disciples to be followers, right? To walk the same path. And they're given the power to do the same things because of that. And Christ says himself that the people who come after him, which means us, will be capable of more than he managed. Right. Well, that doesn't mean that there's no redemption by proxy, let's say, because we already covered that, is that if you aim up, you have the Spirit that's inviting you up. You've invited it to take residence in you. And that's true. That's true, as far as I can see. I think it's the most accurate way of construing the situation. That does give you a form of, it gives you what Ian found, right? It gives you a spine. But that doesn't mean you don't have a cross, right? And that you see that insistence in the gospel accounts. As I said, the insistence that Christ suffered as a man despite having God, being God. Those are both true at the same time. So the Christian pathway is the pathway of maximal self-sacrificial responsibility. Right.
Well, I hope those who have been wondering whether you should be legitimately called a Christian in their worldview, in their version of Christianity, will be helped by this conversation. I mean, I suppose that's in part what I'm trying to do too here, is for people who say to you, just say what you think. It's complicated, but hopefully.
Well, I am trying to say what I think.
Yeah.
It's just that the world's a complicated place.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we're
And
helping to make it.
It's nice to get your words in pristine order, but the more complicated the topic, the longer it takes to manage that with stellar precision.
Yeah. Well, it's taken us probably nearly 2 hours now just to get about around to the idea of maybe you don't know if the Jews walked through the Egyptian desert, but maybe that also
They're still walking.
Maybe
through
that also
the
maybe they're
Egyptian
still.
Good to talk to you.
It's been fun.
All right, so everyone, I'm going to continue this conversation. We're going to continue this conversation on the Daily Wire platform, and so I think I'll talk to Alex a bit more personally. I want to find out how he managed his podcast and why he's interested in the things he's interested in, what his pathway to that occupation was, and what his hopes for the future are, and all of that. And so if you want to join us on the Daily Wire side, please do. Thank you to the film crew here. We're in LA. Right, we're in LA. And thank you very much for coming all the way from London. That's very good. And it was a fine conversation. Much appreciated.
Yeah, enjoyed it very
And
much.
thank you, all of you who are watching and listening, for your time and attention. Well, hopefully we'll see you on the Daily Wire side. And if not, then, well, for the next podcast.
That's much harder than I expected it to be. Oh my god. This is a bit unbalanced, but I don't know what to do with it. This is a bit too easy. If you look, yeah, that's easy, very easy. But unless I scale these, there's nothing I could do. I could scale these, but I'm not sure if I want to do so. Alright, what else do you have? Alright then, what do we have here?
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered. In 10 minutes. Let's see how he does.
Atheists have a lot of arguments, but they never really think of anything new that the church hasn't had answers to for the past 2,000 years. So let's answer them. Religion causes wars. Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion. And if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%.
Right off the bat, this isn't really an argument for atheism, just for the idea that religion is harmful. Even if religion caused no wars at all, that's no actual evidence that any religion is true. Still, even if religion only causes 7% of wars, isn't it a problem that it causes any wars? The claim is not that religion causes all wars, or even most wars, just that it sometimes causes wars. I mean, to use a crude example, as far as I'm aware, National Socialism only ever caused one war. One out of the thousands that we have documented. But, of course, even if the vast majority of wars were started for other reasons, it's still a problem that this caused a war at all. Not a perfect analogy, but you get what I'm saying. And it's worth asking, wherever there is a totally non-religious conflict.
So far good. I wonder if I want to play. I really don't know. Maybe I do. Well then.
Do you think that such a conflict would be calmed or exacerbated if we were to introduce religious conviction? Perhaps only the correct religion would make things better. That's fine, you can hold that position, but then even a believer can accept that many religions do often cause conflicts, or at least make them worse.
A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists. This doesn't mean religion is true, it just means you can't use that as an argument against it.
I just want to point out that whilst religious violence is motivated by religious beliefs, atheist violence is rarely motivated by atheism. It's at best permitted by someone's atheism, but then religious violence is also permitted by the person's religious beliefs as well as being encouraged by them. But okay, on the Hitler thing. Look, I don't know what his religious views really were. Some say he was a Catholic, the religion he was baptized into and confirmed in. He did also write in Mein Kampf that, quote, "In standing guard against the Jew, I am doing the handiwork of the Lord." Not a particularly atheist statement, but then Hitler was probably quite good at, well, lying. And perhaps the belief of some, even to this day, that he was a convicted theist is just a testament to the strength of his propagandic efforts. But if he was lying, and didn't actually believe in God, then it's worth asking why he would think that lying about being religious would make his fascist campaign more successful. Whatever his own views personally were, he had every Nazi soldier wear belt buckles inscribed with the words "Gott mit uns," God with us. Clearly, even if he was personally an atheist, Hitler recognized that belief in a creator God can give people the confidence to do all kinds of evil.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
Well, this just misses the point. Sure,
Yes.
all beliefs are shaped by their geography, but atheists don't claim that there's a God supervising the world who proactively wants everyone to believe in him. If such a God did exist, would we really expect him to reveal himself more strongly and reliably to, say, Americans than to Indonesians? It seems incredibly unlikely and unfair that your chances of being saved, of coming to know the true God, could be determined by where you happen to be born. If atheism is true, however, it's no surprise that where you're born shapes your religious beliefs, because that's what we think religious beliefs are. Products of local mythology or political dominance. So yeah, if I was born in Indonesia, I'd probably be a Muslim. But whilst that's exactly what we'd expect if there is no universal God supervising everything and it's all just a product of local mythology, it's nothing like what we'd expect if there were a real universal God. By the way, I call this the
This guy is like ChatGPT. I like it.
genetic fallacy.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
Nothing to add here. Yes, every worldview should be justified.
There's no scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world. So science can neither prove nor disprove God.
So, God can't influence the natural world and or never did. Like, it was never documented. So, what's the point? If he has no influence on our world.
That's fine if you want to say that science has nothing to say about God, but you've just undercut a great deal of natural theology. You're disagreeing with everybody who tries to prove God's existence with the fine-tuning argument, or the Big Bang in the Kalam cosmological argument, irreducible complexity, arguments about the genetic code, indeed, even the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus. These just automatically cannot work in establishing God's existence, since material investigations can't bear on the supernatural. Well, this is fortuitous. Literally, as I was recording this video, Redeemed Zoomer released a new video called All Arguments for God Explained in 10 Minutes. Now, given that he's just said that science can never bear on the supernatural and can't prove or disprove God's existence, just take a listen to this.
Things in nature, like the human cell or the ecosystem of the world, are very complex and they work like a machine. Now, Darwinian evolution can explain why that is, but there's also things Darwinian evolution can't explain, like the 4 constants of the universe. There are physical constants like the gravitational constant and the electron charge, the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force that are perfectly fine-tuned, such that if they were even the slightest bit different, the entire universe would immediately collapse in on itself.
Sounds pretty...
Maybe there are tons of universes where those constants are not suitable for any complex life. You would never be able to experience those kinds of universes. And there might be multiple. Very, very many. A lot. But of course, the only universe that you can experience is the one that would let you be conscious, have a body and a brain, you know.
I don't know, scientific, doesn't it? So it seems like when an atheist is arguing that science disproves God, No, science and religion are totally separate, non-overlapping magisteria. But when it comes to proving God's existence, hey, look at these finely tuned constants. Isn't that amazing?
There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking in languages they don't know, for example,
That's not
and
true.
people with near-death experiences getting information they never had access to.
Okay, medically documented cases of people with demonic possession sounds awesome. I would love to take a look at that, medical documentation. I get the feeling you're not going to provide any, are you? Fear not, we do have one source that was flashed on screen, a book by Richard Gallagher called Demonic Foes. So, okay, I bought the book. I only skimmed through a couple of chapters, but I did also watch a few of Dr. Gallagher's interviews. In the book, he talks about some of his experiences with people he believes were demonically possessed, including a woman he calls Julia. Evidence for demonic possession consists principally in people like Julia having special powers. One night, Dr. Gallagher heard his normally peaceful cats screeching and fighting with each other. And the next day, he meets a woman he calls Julia, who says, "How'd you like those cats last night?" Weird, for sure, but not quite yet the medical documentation that we're seeking. So then, what other special powers did Julia have? Well, Dr. Gallagher writes in the Washington Post of how she knew things that she couldn't have known naturally, including exactly how his mother had died years ago. But also, get this, she could tell some people their secret weaknesses, such as undue pride.
What?
Okay, but how about this? Julia, during various exorcisms, was suddenly able to speak fluent Latin out of nowhere. We're not told what she said, of course, but it happened. And, if you can believe it, in one ceremony she actually levitated out of her chair, literally floating in the air for half an hour. Atheists cannot explain that one. But we don't have to take Dr. Gallagher's word for this. Oh no. Actually, we can't, because he didn't see this himself. But we can just accept that the people who did see her levitate and told him about it were super trustworthy. We'll just have to take his word about somebody else's word. That's not to say that I can prove she wasn't possessed, or that Dr. Gallagher's priests were mistaken or lying, but this book, which is the only citation Redeemed Zuma provided, hardly fulfills my evidential expectations. But here's the thing, even if you could provide some kind of actual medical evidence for demonic possession, didn't you literally just say that science can never prove anything supernatural? Maybe you just think this wouldn't count as scientific evidence? But if there can't be any scientific documentation of demonic possession, then what kind of evidence are you talking about here? Anecdotes? Testimony? It's just not doing it for me. Of course, people are always making claims about the way that things occurred, and today, information is released faster than it can be verified, and on the internet, manipulative algorithms can often reinforce our own confirmation biases, which is why platforms like Ground News are more essential than ever. I think that what they're doing is really important.
Isn't this a bad source? I heard it. But, well...
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
Every contradiction? All of them? Look, you're right, I wouldn't claim to have discovered some new contradiction that nobody has noticed before. I would just say that the proposed solutions to...
Because they're so fucking visible and obvious. It's hard not to notice them.
Many of them seem to be, shall we say, theologically motivated. The one contradiction that you flashed on screen is probably the least troublesome contradiction that you could possibly have chosen. So, how about, for instance, 1. Matthew and Luke give different genealogies for Jesus' lineage. Matthew says that Jacob is Joseph's father, whilst Luke says that Heli is Joseph's father. Some people claim that Luke is actually giving Mary's lineage while Matthew is giving Joseph's. Heli is Mary's father, it's just recorded as Joseph's father because Joseph was Heli's son-in-law. Augustine's solution to this problem was to suggest that Joseph was actually adopted, so Jacob is his biological father while Heli is his adopted father. And sure, these are both possible, but are they really the most natural interpretation of the text if you're not already motivated to harmonize the accounts? It's not impossible to reconcile them in this kind of way, but doesn't the need to do so at least slightly lower your credence in the text? 2. The date of Jesus' crucifixion. Was it after the Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels claim, or the eve of the Passover, as John's Gospel claims? My friend and biblical scholar John Nelson just wrote an article on this contradiction. He's a Christian who used to think it could be reconciled, but changed his mind. I'll link it down below. His new Substack, behindthegospels.com, is well worth subscribing to if you're into this kind of thing. 3. In John's Gospel, after finding Jesus' tomb empty, Mary Magdalene runs to Simon Peter and John and says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have put him." Strange thing for her to say if, as Matthew records, an angel appeared to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, telling her exactly where Jesus had gone, and then Jesus himself appeared to her when she was on the way to the disciples. Why would she then have said to the disciples, "We do not know where they have taken the Lord"? 4. Jesus is sending out his disciples to teach. In Mark, he tells them, "Take nothing for the journey except a staff." In Luke, he tells them, "Take nothing for the journey, no staff." So, do they take a staff or not? In Barnabas Ahern's essay, Staff or No Staff, he suggests that there are two types of staff that Jesus is talking about in either account. He points out that Augustine distinguished between a real staff in Matthew's Gospel and a metaphorical staff in Mark's Gospel. I mean, sure, if you absolutely need the accounts to harmonize, you can suggest all kinds of reasons for this apparent contradiction. But wouldn't it be easier to just say that, yeah, the accounts are different? Because look, who the hell cares about small contradictions? If these documents are truly historical accounts, we'd expect them to have minor differences as people try to accurately remember events and remember them slightly differently. If two witnesses in a court case give a story that perfectly matches up in every single detail, that's actually cause for suspicion. It's evidence that they've made up the story and rehearsed it. So I don't see contradictions like this as a big problem, but you want to claim that there are no contradictions to be found at all. And I'm sorry, but I'm just not convinced that these kinds of explanations cut the mustard seed.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
Okay, the consensus of New
Very
Testament scholars
trustworthy.
seems to be that we don't have sufficient evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. But what was it that you just said? We literally have writings from church fathers who can verify the traditional authorship of the Gospels? You've shown a picture on screen of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who, look, I don't know very much about, but I think you've basically just lied about him. We only know anything about him at all via his letters and tradition. Tradition, which states he was a disciple of John, but with very patchy evidence. Some of Ignatius's followers wrote an account of his martyrdom that says he was a disciple of John. So, sure, maybe Ignatius knew John. But where the hell have you gotten this idea that Ignatius can verify John's authorship of the fourth gospel? Even in the letters Ignatius allegedly wrote to John, now recognized to be forgeries anyway, we don't have any clear endorsement from Ignatius of the idea that John wrote this gospel. It seems that Ignatius's epistles were influenced by the theology of John's gospel, so he probably read it, but that's a far cry from making any commentary about its authorship. For the record, church patristics is really not my area. I don't know very much here, so don't look to me for advice on this. I actually reached out to one of my old theology tutors to see if he could help me figure out what I might be missing, but look, I might just be missing something here. I'm genuinely interested in seeing where Redeemed Zuma has gotten this evidence that Ignatius can confirm that John wrote the fourth gospel. So if you're watching this, RZ, let me know.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church.
Wait, hold on. It's true that some secular scholars think this? What other kind of scholars do you want? Religiously motivated ones? Secular just means not affected by religion, which any scholar should be in regards to their scholarship, even if they're a Christian. Maybe you meant to say atheist instead of secular? I'm not sure. But I mean, imagine if I was making a video about climate change and I said something like, well, yeah, sure, some researchers who aren't funded by oil will say that climate change is real. That's kind of what it sounds like here.
Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can discard their opinions.
Because scholars can't agree on which quotes of Jesus are legitimate, we can throw out their skepticism? What? The whole argument is precisely that scholars can't agree on which quotes of Jesus are authentic. That's the whole problem. Do you really think that this lack of consensus about which quotes are authentic is a problem not with the quotes, but with the scholars? Come on. Hey, here's a fun exercise. Try, without rewinding this video, to write down the exact contents of my previous sentence. I mean it. Pause the video, write down the last sentence I just said, word for word, and then compare it to what I actually said. I bet you can't remember it accurately, at least not perfectly, and yet you heard me say it mere seconds ago. Now consider that even the most conservative estimates place the authorship of the Gospels at least decades after Jesus' death, and yet we're supposed to believe that they never misquote Jesus?
Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. He didn't say, "I am God, worship me," but he showed that he was God in many places in all four Gospels by doing things that only God can do. It's true that he didn't walk around before his resurrection claiming to be God, because he wanted people to figure it out themselves. That's why he kept saying, "Who do you say that I am?" However, after his resurrection, people figured out that he was God, and Jesus congratulated them.
That's why he kept saying, "Who do you say I am?" Doesn't he say that just, like, once? More subtle hyperbole, perhaps. Anyway, did Jesus claim to be God? I have a whole podcast about this with Bart Ehrman. It's a really interesting one if you don't mind a bit of self-promo. But the long and short of it is that Jesus definitely seems to claim to be God in John's Gospel, but maybe not so much in the Synoptics. But you've just put some examples on the screen from the Synoptic Gospels, so let's take a look at one of them. You've identified forgiving sins as something that only God can do. I wouldn't be so sure. Take a look at John chapter 20, verse 21 onwards. Jesus is speaking here to his disciples after the resurrection. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." So the apostles had the power to forgive sins. This is clearly the gospel showing that the apostles are all God, right? Because forgiving sins is something that only God can do. Obviously not. Maybe you'll say something like, well, they could forgive sins because Jesus gave them that power, but it's still Jesus' power, really. But take notice, Jesus said to them, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." So if Jesus sending the disciples to forgive sins doesn't make them gods, then the Father sending Jesus to forgive sins doesn't make him God either. I could go on for ages about this, but watch my podcast with Bart Ehrman instead.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time. Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels? So that breaks your pattern.
Yeah, sure, if the claim is about whether the authors of the Gospels thought Jesus was divine, I have no problem saying that the earliest Gospel, Mark, seems to imply that Jesus is God from the very first chapter. The more interesting point, however, is not that later Gospels make Jesus more divine, but that they provide more evidence for his divinity as time goes on. The earliest copies of Mark contain no post-resurrection appearances. Matthew and Luke contain some post-resurrection appearances, and John then contains even more. So the later the source, the more records of these kinds of appearances, which after all are the principal proof of Jesus' resurrection, which in turn is the principal proof of his divinity. Now sure, Paul still upsets this pattern, writing that 500 people saw the risen Christ, but this is in a different category of evidence. The Gospels are, according to you at least, eyewitness accounts of a physically resurrected man. Paul, however, tells us of a vision that he had of a bright light, never meeting a fleshy Jesus himself. And as for the 500 that he talks about, this is Paul telling us that he's heard that some other unnamed people saw the risen Jesus. That's not to say it didn't happen, just that it can't be considered on the same level as the allegedly eyewitness accounts provided by the Gospels, which do get more and more detailed and fanciful the later they were written.
The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it. There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state.
Some Old Testament verses could be interpreted as condoning slavery. Seriously. There's just no way that anybody who reads the Hebrew Bible can seriously defend this. Genuinely, this is the most untenable position in the entire video, if you ask me. Once again, I have a whole podcast about this time with Joshua Bowen. It's over an hour and a half of detailed descriptions of exactly how the Bible supports slavery. But just to take some examples, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished, that is probably by death, if the slave dies as a direct result, but they're not to be punished with death if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. I suppose this could be interpreted as the Old Testament endorsing slavery. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Sure, maybe this could be interpreted as the Old Testament endorsing slavery, but of course the New Testament does away with all of this. In the Old Testament, God, despite completely prohibiting all kinds of practices, including imaginary crimes like witchcraft, obviously couldn't abolish slavery for whatever reason. But the New Testament solved this problem with verses such as 1 Peter 2:18. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Oh. Okay, now Peter does say that this is because it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, implying that it's unjust for slave owners to be cruel to their slaves, which is great. But it does still say that they should submit nonetheless, and certainly seems to at least accept the practice of slavery in general. Paul in Ephesians also legitimizes the practice of slavery. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Again, Paul does then go on to say that masters should also treat their slaves in the same respectful way, since the father doesn't favor the master over the slave, which is great and progressive for the time, perhaps, but it still recognizes the earthly practice of slavery and doesn't take the opportunity to condemn the practice in principle. Now, for what it's worth, maybe the kind of slavery described here, where masters are good to their slaves and perhaps good for their slaves, is nowhere near as bad as the kind of slavery that comes to mind from, say, American history. Maybe this kind of slavery is actually perfectly moral, but to say that the Bible didn't condone and legitimize it at all is simply untrue. Some people like to point to a verse in Galatians where Paul writes that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, but he's clearly talking here about the relevance of either status to salvation, not the existence of the practice on earth. I mean, in the very next words he says, "Nor is there male and female," but I never see Christians using this verse to justify a biblically motivated gender abolitionism.
And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary.
Well, the fact that the so-called slave Bible could exist at all is a problem. This text isn't framed so much as a censored Bible with bits taken out, but rather a collection of select texts from the Bible. Just like how you might have a collection of Bible verses for use in overcoming grief or something that omits a great deal of chapters. This was a Bible created for the express purpose of reading to slaves in the West Indies. But why would you be able to use any of a Bible, which I'm told doesn't condone slavery, to, promote and maintain slavery? The parts that aren't in the slave Bible include the Exodus story, the Psalms, and Revelation, which certainly contain themes of freedom, particularly in the Exodus, of course. But these omissions do not in any way count against the fact that elsewhere in the Bible there are much more specific verses that definitely condone and legislate slavery.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds.
Sure, many societies condone slavery throughout history, but you claim that your tradition is the correct one, with access to the will of the God of the universe. Yes, Aristotle condoned slavery, but his Politics is not thought to be a divinely authored text. Why did it take so long, literally over 1,000 years, for Christian society to abolish slavery if it was so obviously against God's will the whole time?
The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian.
Okay, to say that I today am against slavery due to exclusively Christian influence is laughable. I know this whole Western ethics are all secretly Christian idea is popular at the moment, but you show me exactly where in your Bible I can find justification for abolishing slavery. I will show you just as many examples, and probably more, of it justifying the exact opposite and doing so much more specifically. Yes, Christians today may condemn slavery, but if we turned back the clock, got in a time machine and went and visited Europe in a time before abolition, and we tried to abolish slavery, where is the first place that the locals would turn, and plausibly so, to defend it as an institution? I think it goes without saying.
God killed tons of people in the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
It's a hell of a response to the problem of natural evil. Why does God allow millions of people to die in earthquakes or tsunamis, or indeed kill them himself on purpose? Because he can. He has the right to kill you, so why not? There isn't much I can say to challenge this. Maybe this is just God's right, I don't know.
Atheist countries are more prosperous. Yes, it's true that Northern European countries are very prosperous and very secular, but correlation doesn't equal causation. It's not like atheism causes prosperity, it's that prosperity causes atheism because when people have comfortable lives, they don't feel a need to depend on God. But why are these particular countries so prosperous in the first place? They may be secular now, but they're rooted in generations and generations of Protestant Christianity. If you want an example of a country that's atheist and not rooted in Christianity, look at communist China.
Yeah, I don't much like this kind of argument. For a start, I don't even really know how you can measure a nation's prosperity without presupposing a bunch of worldview assumptions. I suppose it's also impossible to say how much a country's prior religion is relevant to its current religion and prosperity level. I mean, sure, communist China grew out of non-Christian society, but communist Russia grew out of an Orthodox Christian society. But anyway, even if religious societies are more prosperous, this only tells us that belief in God is socially beneficial, not that God actually exists. Still something atheists bring up all the time, of course, so I completely understand why it's worth including this, but just bear that in mind.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of God exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
Yeah, I agree with this. It's a bad argument if it is an argument. I do find that it's a useful tool for helping people to understand what it's like to not believe in God, but it certainly doesn't function as an actual argument against any God.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
Yeah, everybody knows that. Right? Sure, first cause arguments are powerful and interesting. I've already discussed them ad nauseum, but briefly, I suppose I'd agree that if they are successful in establishing a first cause, it wouldn't really make sense to ask what caused that cause. Giving it attributes of traditional theism, however, is of course a separate question.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
I've talked about this before too. Sure, the founding fathers of science were religious, but who wasn't back then? And even if they weren't religious, we'd never know about it, since even expressing unorthodox cosmology, let alone atheism, was enough to get Galileo put under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life. But more importantly, suppose for a second that it were the case that science completely disproves religion. I'm obviously not saying that it does, but if it did, then of course the founding fathers of science would have been religious, because they hadn't yet invented the scientific method that would go on to disprove religion. It's like saying, isn't it interesting that the Wright brothers, who invented the aeroplane that supposedly went on to produce the Boeing 747 jet, didn't themselves own a Boeing 747 jet? Doesn't that tell us something? And look, it may be true that early scientists were inspired by their theism. You say that the church invented modern science? A dubious claim perhaps, but I'll just grant it. If so, so what? Just because science originated with religious thinkers That doesn't make it impossible for science to have gone on to then undermine religion. Protestantism grew out of Catholicism, for example. That doesn't mean that it can't undermine it.
God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet. Well, actually, God is the...
His voice is so fucking... He sounds like this guy. He does not sound like this guy at all.
The reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
I agree that this is how a theist should respond to the God of the Gaps objection. Even if something is explained by science, the whole scientific enterprise as a whole and the existence of scientific laws at all might still rely on a divine cause. But historically speaking, people have used God in this way and said that there are things that cannot be explained by science and used this as evidence for God's existence. Still, I think we're in agreement here that scientific explanations and divine agency can coexist peacefully.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you.
Okay, I totally get the Christian idea that human beings are corrupted and evil. Of course, all of us constantly fall short, even of our own moral standards. Fine, so destroying evil requires destroying us. But you've just said that God will one day destroy all evil. He just can't do it now, because that would mean destroying humans. But what will change so that one day he can destroy evil without destroying humans? And why can't that happen now? As far as I was aware, the thing that allows human beings to escape being justly destroyed for their sin is the sacrifice of Jesus, which happened a good couple of thousand years ago now. So what is God waiting for to destroy evil? Perhaps you're talking about the second coming of Christ, Judgment Day, but then what changes about the world between now and then that God is suddenly able to destroy evil without destroying humans?
Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
Well, look, I appreciate how blunt this is. I was expecting some kind of theodicy. Evil exists because it's soul building, or because of free will, or because of heavenly compensation. But no, we just deserve it. Well, fine, but I just want to bring that home for a minute. This week, about 5 children in the UK alone will die from cancer. The most common type of cancer in children is leukemia. I know you wouldn't say this to their face, Redeemed Zoomer, but when a parent asks why on earth this has happened to their child, you think that the in fact correct response is, well, they deserve it. Look, I can't disprove that they do deserve it. Maybe humanity is just so corrupted by original sin or whatever that we do deserve pediatric cancer. But even if we do, why do some people get what they deserve and not others? It's not just that people suffer at all, in other words, but that they do so seemingly randomly and arbitrarily.
Well, the will of God is so hard to comprehend. You know. Religious cocks.
Sometimes by accident of birth or genetics. Lucky for the rest of us, I guess?
Well, animals don't sin, so why do they suffer? Well, the Bible says all things will be restored, so if God is good, we can assume that they will be compensated.
Right, so animals will be compensated in the afterlife because they don't deserve to suffer. But those children who died of cancer shouldn't be compensated, of course. You know, the ones who do deserve it. Luckily, Jesus paid the price for those kids, and they'll get to inherit eternal life anyway, even though they deserve to be destroyed. But for some reason, that sacrifice only gets rid of the punishment they deserve in the invisible next life. Not in this one. In this one, they get cancer,
Jesus.
because they deserve it. Animals suffer in this world too, for some reason that you haven't even attempted to explain, but that's also fine, because God will pay them off, probably.
How do you know that God isn't evil instead? Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light.
What?
Evil is just a lack...
What?
lack of good, and for good to be objective, it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
Yeah, sure. If you think that evil is just a privation of good, then I guess there can't exist a maximally evil being. I suppose I'm just unconvinced by that analysis of what good and evil are. But maybe you're convinced of it. I know that it's a popular view. One reason it strikes me as unintuitive is because if I imagine two possible worlds, one in which nothing at all exists, and one in which a bunch of suffering exists, if evil is just a privation of good, then since they both contain no good, we'd have to say that they're about as bad as each other. That might not be correct under this view, I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like a good way to capture what we think is evil about suffering. But anyway, I'm an ethical emotivist, so of course I'm going to understand these terms differently to you.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself or that he can contradict himself.
Yeah, I think I agree with this explanation. If omnipotence just means the ability to do all logically possible things, then God can be omnipotent even if he can't create a rock too heavy for him to lift. Or a friend of mine puts it like this: yes, God can do all things, but logical contradictions aren't things. They literally have no referent, even conceptually. Still, I think that there are other, better paradoxes. Take this one about omniscience. Does God know all true propositions? Most theists would say yes. But if so, that would mean that whenever he knows a proposition, P, he must also then know the true proposition, God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition. It's true that God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition, and so on to infinity. So, if God knows all true propositions, he must know an actually infinite number of things. Many philosophers think that actual infinites are impossible, and so this causes a problem. Okay, we can respond to this by saying that God doesn't think in terms of true propositions, but rather in a single, undivided intuition. There might be other responses too, but at any rate, I think a much more interesting paradox than the stone so heavy he can't lift thing.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having...
What? This is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Oh my god. How can he even think of himself being this guy? You cannot say this and look like this. You can only look like this. Saying this
just
shit.
never existed.
Oh my
I'm not
God.
convinced by this. The way that I've put it before is like
Nobody
this.
is.
Martin Luther King is widely considered to be a good man. Why? Because he overcame the evils of racism. Are we glad to find ourselves in a world with racism so that we can have the good of overcoming it? Wouldn't you rather do without the racism and without the need to overcome it? Triumph over evil is only good insofar as it overcomes something evil. Without the evil to start with, the desire to create it just to overcome it seems really strange. It's like saying that we should be very glad of the existence of cancer, because without it, we wouldn't have the good of cancer research and chemotherapy. These things are undoubtedly good, and they couldn't exist were it not for cancer. Would we invent the latter to permit the glory of the former? It sounds to me like you're saying this is what God does.
Religion is just wishful thinking.
Yes.
Well, if that were true, then the Bible wouldn't be all about how much we all suck.
Well, not if Nietzsche's right, for a start. Think about this. For a great many people throughout history, who Nietzsche calls the slave class, they've been simply unable to avoid being weak, servile, and submissive. This is just their position in life, and there's no hope of changing it. The so-called slave morality concept imagines that to deal with this sorry state, people began to turn their helpless condition into a virtue, and began to take the things that they desired but couldn't get, like strength and dominance and wealth, etc., and condemned them as evil. And this is a kind of wishful thinking. I mean, imagine that you're poor and oppressed and there's no hope of changing your condition. What would wishful thinking look like? Sure, you could just wish to become rich tomorrow, but that's not going to happen, so this wouldn't be an effective strategy to help you feel better. However, if instead you develop a worldview that trains you to wish to be poor, to wish to be servile and submissive, and teaches you to no longer want wealth and strength, that these things are immoral, well, this is a much more effective strategy of getting what you want. You change your wants. I don't even need riches in life because my riches await me in heaven. This is the kind of wishful thinking that might be involved in Christianity. The same goes for what Redeemed Zuma is talking about here, our fallen state more generally, that we all suck, as he puts it. Sure, we all do immoral things all the time, and so it's consoling to think that this is recognized by God and that all will be made right and forgiven. Again, I'm not saying that this is the case, that it's all wishful thinking, but this rebuttal that wishful thinking can't look like this, I think is wrong.
Psychology explains why you believe in God. So what?
Yes.
If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him.
Again,
What?
I more or less agree with this.
Spiritual, experiential, or social benefit to believing in him.
Again, I more or less agree with this.
Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals. Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real.
Again, I agree, because any experience of the brain, whether natural or not in origin, will be describable in terms of brain chemicals. But a better argument is not about what's happening in the brain, but rather what caused the activity in the brain. Sure, love just being chemicals in my brain doesn't prove that my wife doesn't exist. But if no experience that I've ever had of my wife was caused by something in the natural world, would you think that my wife must be some supernatural entity that my brain is intercepting? Or would you think that maybe she doesn't exist and that my brain has invented her?
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Sure, but people who take LSD and DMT will tell you that they're totally different experiences too. The point about drugs is just that the brain can sometimes experience inexplicable and ineffable things without necessarily indicating the involvement of anything beyond the materials of the brain.
The story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus or some other ancient character. Okay, dude, that's a Reddit atheist-level myth. Even atheist scholars know that that's silly.
Agreed.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
Yeah, but the thing is, I either have sufficient reason to trust something, or I don't. With food, for example, if I'm served a meal at a restaurant, sure, I trust that it's not going to poison me, but I know that my country has strict food laws, and that the restaurant has a huge interest in protecting my safety, and that poisonings are rare. But if I travel abroad to some places, for example, I won't trust the tap water. And with the wife example, I get what you're saying, but imagine if I gave my wife no evidence that I loved her, like nothing at all. And then when she said she was questioning the marriage, I just said, "Oh, you've got to have faith, baby." I think I'd be getting divorced.
Evolution proves God didn't create the world. Well, not necessarily. God often works through natural processes in the Bible. And for all of church history, there have been prominent Christian theologians who have had a more metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, even well over 1,000 years before Darwin existed.
Of course, this is true, but I don't know anyone who claims that evolution proves God didn't make the world, except outside of the strict context, I suppose, of arguing with a biblical literalist. But then you've just implied that you agree that evolution disproves the biblical literalist interpretation.
Christianity only spread because of military conquest. Well, eventually they did do military conquest, but for the first 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal, and it took over the Roman Empire despite that because of how popular it became.
Again, I'm happy to broadly agree. At least early Christianity was not some kind of violent conquest.
Constantine invented what we now know of as Christianity. Again, Reddit atheist-level myth. Atheists can do better than that. Listen to an actual scholar.
I suppose Redeemed Zuma is just throwing out a few of the less tenable arguments at the end here, in case people support them. Again, yeah, I don't think that Constantine invented modern Christianity.
If Christianity is true, why are there so many denominations of it? Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
You know, people often say this about different religions altogether. I hear them say things like, you know, all religions really just agree on the main stuff. I think they often underestimate just how different they are. But sure, the existence of denominations is not incompatible with the truth of Christianity. However, I do wonder why God allows so many honest truth seekers to go wrong, to get the wrong interpretation of his words, especially in places where a person's denomination is predictable based on their parents' or community's denomination. But that just takes us back to the divine hiddenness argument from earlier.
There's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. Well, that's not true. There's the ancient Jewish historian Josephus who wrote about Jesus, and he's one of the reasons why even secular scholars know Jesus historically existed.
Yes, there are indeed non-biblical sources that point to Jesus' existence. However, it is worth noticing something about the passage from Josephus that you've just put on screen. Josephus certainly removes doubt about the existence of Jesus, but the authenticity of a fair bit of this particular passage is under dispute by scholars, principally because Josephus, a Jew, refers here to Jesus as the Messiah, or Christ, and says that he rose from the dead, and that he may not have been just a man. Strange things for a Jew to say, and thus some believe that these passages are later Christian additions. If, however, Josephus did write these words, then they clearly weren't enough even to convince him of Jesus' divinity, since he remained Jewish, and so it probably shouldn't convince us either. But on the point of Jesus' mere existence, yes, I agree. I think we can believe it.
You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you? Yes.
That's sweet, of course, but sounds a little, I don't know, wishful? Let me know what you think. I've been Alex O'Connor. Subscribe if you want to. I'll see you in the next one.
Oh my god. Yes. Some of them. I need no clip, I'm sorry. Where are the worst philosophy takes or whatever that was called? I wonder what that might be.
I asked for more of your philosophical hot takes and will again be ranking their spiciness. And yes, minty is still very much the opposite of spicy. And if you don't like it, get to like it. The most valuable form of human life is a full-grown adult, 18 to 35, and so in war, child soldiers should fight for them instead of the adults fighting for the children. Creating more children is easy, but creating a fully developed and free functioning human takes time and money. Say what you will about this, ladies and gentlemen, this is an Indian spicy take. Of course, it relies on a rather cold and calculating functional idea of what makes something valuable, but in a way it makes some kind of sense. Who's worth more, a newborn child, which you could just make another one tomorrow, or a fully grown adult who not only has their own life, their own history, memories, people that care about them, but also, as the commenter points out, is probably also more functionally useful to the society that they live in. So why is it then that our moral intuitions are reversed? Why would we rather save the child than the adult? Putting aside the fact that child soldiers probably aren't quite as effective as adult soldiers, I think this also demonstrates that morality is simply not about this kind of functional value. And it may be there's no good way to justify why we should save a child over an adult, other than that, well, they're more innocent and that just feels wronger. But if that's the case, then perhaps this is just a good demonstration of ethical emotivism, the idea that moral claims are just reducible to emotional expression. We strongly intuitively feel that the strong should protect the weak, that children shouldn't fight in wars, that adults have a duty to protect those younger than them. Can this be justified on a transactional, mathematical morality that underpins the claim that this commenter is making? No. But maybe that just shows that this isn't what ethics is all about. I believe physically and scientifically that we revolve around the sun, but in a metaphysical sense, the universe revolves around the Earth, because the Earth is the only place that has life, and therefore everyone who observes the universe. Functionally speaking, we are the center. They've labeled this philosophical heliocentrism. I think they meant to say philosophical geocentrism, and this, once again, ladies and gentlemen, is an Indian spicy take. That's right, geocentrism is back. There's no universal frame of reference in the universe. If you're on some planet and a spaceship is moving away from you, that planet is moving away from the spaceship just as the spaceship is moving away from the planet. The only thing which determines which one's still and which one's moving is where you place the observer. And yeah, okay, the orbital patterns make it seem as though the Earth is revolving around the Sun, and the Sun is moving around in our Milky Way galaxy. But that's only from a particular frame of reference. If your frame of reference is the Earth, then everything else in the universe is revolving around it. It's just doing so in a pretty weird pattern. I am absolutely in love with this idea, and especially given that frames of reference require an observer, and Earth is the only place with any observers on it. Yeah, except for those on the ISS, but that's basically on the Earth anyway. Why does it not make perfect sense to say that, yeah, in a metaphysical, observational sense, the Earth is the center of the universe? Geocentrism is so back. We can never be ourselves. We're simply a product of everyone around us. I think I'm going to have to give this mild. It's an interesting thing to think about, but it's hardly original. It's impossible to even learn how to speak and use language, let alone creating worldviews and cultures without the input of other people. But it's not just the people around you today that shape who you are, it's also those who came before you, your ancestors. And have you ever wondered about where it is that you come from? Well, in this video, I partnered with MyHeritage to show you exactly how you can find that information out. It'll give you an ethnicity estimate, a breakdown of your origins across 42 supported ethnicities and 2,100. Let's move on. On AI art/imagery, the thing that happens when a human takes inspiration from artwork is not meaningfully different from what happens when AI looks at art, steals its data, swaps it around, and makes something new out of it.
That's true.
If one is made illegal, so too should the other. Given what a hot topic this is at the moment, I think this is a spicy take. A lot of people have an ethical qualm with AI art because, of course, AI is trained on a large data set, and a lot of the artists whose work is in that data set did not give their consent to the AI being trained on it. It's seen as a kind of plagiarism. When somebody presents this argument in precisely this way, I tend to agree with the commenter. There isn't much of a meaningful difference here to me between AI doing that and a human being growing up, listening to a bunch of other people's work, and eventually producing something of their own. You can't just live your life in complete isolation, learn how a musical scale works, and then create a pop song out of nothing. And especially in music, this leads to scandals of plagiarism. Did Ed Sheeran rip off Marvin Gaye? Did Coldplay rip off Joe Satriani? Who knows? What it does show is that art is never produced in a vacuum, and the people who made the music that was the inspiration for your favorite song were not credited in that song's production. And if human beings can get away with that, why not AI too? I think in time this debate will become popular enough that this view will be seen as relatively standard, but for now, I'm going to call it spicy. If you're a Christian who believes in A, hell, and B, the age of salvation, there is no morally or biblically consistent way to justify not killing as many children as you can while you're alive. I think by the age of salvation here is meant something like the age of accountability, so an age after which you can be judged and sent to heaven or hell. So if you believe that there's a hell and children of sufficient youth are guaranteed to avoid it, why wouldn't you do them all a favor and kill them? This sounds like a fairly spicy take, but in debates around religion, this idea does come up a lot as an objection. Well, why don't you just kill people if they all get to go to heaven anyway? So I think I'm forced to give it mild. It sounds spicy because it sounds like you're saying you should kill loads of children, but you're not doing that. You're actually just making an objection to Christianity. They say there's no morally or biblically consistent way to not justify killing children, but I think the Bible's quite clear that murder is wrong. Now that's complicated, of course, by the fact that God condones and instructs the killing of children at numerous points throughout the Old Testament, but I think it's fair to say on a Christian worldview that without explicit divine command, such as in those interesting Old Testament stories, it's wrong to kill innocent children. Having said that, doesn't it make it all the more sacrificial? If you killed a bunch of children and got rewarded because you sent a bunch of kids to heaven, then fine, but if you're forced to go to hell yourself as a result of liberating these children from hell, isn't that just so much more of a virtuous sacrifice? In fact, taking that into consideration, I think I am going to bump this up to spicy. My moral hot take is that incest is not morally wrong if both of the parties consent and don't produce a baby. Or maybe same-sex incest because the heterosexual kind still has the possibility to produce a baby. Whenever I ask for philosophical hot takes, incest comes up a lot. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that it's well known that it's surprisingly difficult to condemn incest on a variety of moral worldviews. If you're some kind of utilitarian that just cares about suffering and pleasure and nothing else, and there's two consenting parties that aren't going to produce any kind of effect on the world around them, then why on earth shouldn't they be able to do it? For some people, this kind of realization tells them, okay, incest is fine then. And for other people, it tells you that, well, because incest is wrong, the philosophy that led us there must be wrong. So you can take your pick. One man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, as they say. I myself am an ethical emotivist, so I think that moral statements are expressions of emotion. That means that if I can't think of a reason why we condemn incest except for finding it kind of icky and disgusting, well, ethical emotivism is one of the few secular ethical theories that can therefore say that incest is, well, wrong. But I'm going to give this mild. Of course, if you said it in a bar or something, you'd get some funny looks, but in the context of discussing ethics and philosophy, it kind of just comes up all the time, and I just find it difficult to give such a common ethical topic the rank of spicy. Having said that, looking at this again, incest is not morally wrong if both of the parties consent and don't produce a baby. Why? Why does having a baby make a difference? Well, because babies of incest are often born disabled. Okay, what's wrong with having disabled children? Sure, you're giving a child a less good life than another child, but if that's the only way that that particular child could exist, then as long as their life is worth living on the whole overall, have you wronged them? This specific discussion...
This is funny. That's where you go when you're not an atheist. When you're a nihilist. You get to answer a lot of really fucking stupid questions like that. Well, probably wrong of me to say get to answer, because there would be no answer if there is no value in suffering. Then there is just no reason not to have a disabled child.
Of the ethics around bringing someone into existence with a deficiency, but such that that specific person couldn't begin to exist without the deficiency, is known as the non-identity problem and is discussed by Derek Parfit in Reasons and Persons. I plan to do an entire video on this at some point in the future, so watch this space. So someone else here has said that incest should not be viewed as a moral issue, but a public health issue. Now this might make some sense to you, but if we start thinking about why morality evolved, especially if we're not moral realists, we might decide that, well, the reason morality evolves in the first place is because societies which develop these kinds of moral considerations for each other are more likely to survive. If that is an account of how morality got going in the human species, then essentially every moral issue ever really started out as a public health issue. We just didn't realize it. Anyway, yeah, whenever I do these videos, incest comes up a lot. I think we've already covered it, but given how much it comes up and is discussed, and given how much sort of shock value it has, I just don't think it's actually that spicy of a philosophical take. That's why I'm going to give it mild. Ethical emotivism is closer to I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds than it is to any competing secular view on morality. This is great. So that's a quote from the Epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament. That's quite emotive language. I mean, when you think with your heart instead of your head, it feels like you're doing something more emotive than rational. And so if ethical emotivism is true, that ethics is something like an expression of emotion, then maybe that's because it's the case that God just put the moral law into our hearts, which is just a poetic way of saying into our emotions. I think that's a really cool idea. It's not something I've heard discussed a ton, and is something I would like to explore further, so I'm going to give it spicy. Ayn Rand is the most underrated philosopher, not because she's great, but because she's rated so unbelievably comically poorly, despite having some good ideas. Okay, yeah, I like this. It's a bit like how I say that the Beatles are underrated, even though they're the most highly rated band of all time. I mean, I don't really have any time for Ayn Rand's objectivism. If you're interested, by the way, I had a debate with a man called Craig Biddle about Ayn Rand's objectivism. I'll link that down below. But people really do dislike Ayn Rand, like a lot. And yeah, I'm not a fan of the philosophy, but is she as bad as people often claim? Maybe not. It's hard to say, but I love this way of framing the concept of overrated and underrated, so well, we'll give it spicy. SpongeBob SquarePants is an elaborate critique of materialism. I've heard a lot of fan theories about SpongeBob, such as that the main characters all represent the 7 deadly sins, so Patrick is sloth and Mr. Krabs is greed and so on, or that the characters all represent different mental disorders, or that they're a result of nuclear contamination. So this really belongs in that category. I don't know if you mean materialism as in the philosophical view that there is only matter in the universe, or if you mean in the political sense of materialism, or in the colloquial sense of caring too much about material things. But SpongeBob SquarePants fan theories are kind of a dime a dozen, and so especially without any further elaboration on this, I'm going to give it mild. Oh, I think I might have been a bit generous in the ratings in this video. There's been a lot of spicy, but then maybe your philosophical hot takes really are just that hot. Whatever the case, I will be asking for more of them in the future, so make sure that you're Elon Musk just sat down with Tucker Carlson for about 2 hours, the better part of 2 hours. He also recently spoke at a Trump rally off the cuff. On both occasions, he said that if Republicans do not get out and vote for Donald Trump, this will be the last election. What do you make of that?
He's just an idiot. I thought I was supposed to have communism after 8 years of Obama, and then I thought I was getting communism after 4 years of Biden. Still hasn't happened. I thought we were getting a wall after 4 years of Trump. Didn't happen. I thought we were getting a balanced budget after 8 years of Bush and 4 years of Trump. Didn't happen. Like, it's just bullshit talking points. That means nothing.
I must say, I was shocked to hear such extreme language. And again, even just from a point of optics, I mean, if that's what he believes, then fine, but to get up and say this will be the last election, I find that sort of difficult to believe that he could take it seriously. But listening to him on Tucker, he's making a very specific point about border crossing. He's making a very specific, he's not saying that there won't literally be elections again. His point is that Democratic policy is opening up the border, flooding the country with immigrants who will be fast-tracked to green card.
Yeah, but the funny fact is that under Joe Biden's presidency, they deported more people, way more people, than under Trump's first term presidency. And even now, Trump deports no more people than Biden did. Oh my God. You can find the stats yourself.
Cards and then citizenship, specifically shipped into swing states where the states can be decided by tens of thousands of votes, shipping in hundreds of thousands of people who will vote Democrat, even though they might be culturally more right-wing where they come from. Their top priority is going to be getting their family to come and live with them, and so they're always going to vote blue. And so if we vote Democrat, we get 4 more years of flooding the border with immigrants who are going to vote blue, thereby flooding the border with even more immigrants who are always going to vote blue, setting up what Elon Musk predicts will be like essentially a one-party country in the way that California is in effect.
That's actually a very interesting theory. But again, Democrats deport a lot of people. So, but if it were the case, then it sounds real, but that was not gonna make the Democrats the only party they would continue on winning the elections forever. They wouldn't have happened in 4 years at least. You need more time than that.
De facto, a one-party state. That's the specific point that he's making. So when he says this will be the last election, he means that this will be the last election with a meaningful discrepancy between right-wing and left-wing voters on issues other than just trying to get their families to come and live with them. Do you think there's any credence in what he's saying?
No, I think that Elon Musk is a 97 IQ man who masquerades as a 137 IQ man, and all of his followers are 85 IQ, so they all believe that he's as smart as he
97 is too much for Elon Musk.
says he is. He wouldn't be able to pass a Civics 101 test. The man is just astoundingly fucking stupid when it comes to talking about anything outside of his very narrow set of expertise, which just seems to be creating a whole bunch of children with a whole bunch of women. So nothing that he says, again, we've been hearing these same arguments for decades. Even what conservatives say, I just caught a guy trying to make this dog shit argument before about bringing in certain types of immigrants that will only vote liberal. Every immigrant votes for liberals because conservatives are fucking insane, and that's their fault. If you can't find a way to appeal to anybody that comes into this country that's not bought in and indoctrinated with your political ideology from birth, that sounds like a
This guy's is insane in the good sense of that word. I like him.
fucking you problem. Because I caught a guy doing, oh, I don't want a bunch of brown, Haitian, black, whatever immigrants coming in. It's like, oh, really? You think people coming from fucking Norway and Sweden are voting for Donald Trump? You think people immigrating from Italy or France or Germany or Poland even are voting for Donald Trump? No, this is not happening. Nobody from around the world comes to the United States like, man, Donald Trump, this guy, it seems like he's making some real good point. I'm going to vote conservative. It doesn't really happen. So every immigrant group, and you can go and look at the poll at the Pew polling for this. Like every immigrant group votes left. That's the conservative problem. And by the way, there's not even a real reason why that has to be the case. Because if conservatives would just not be fucking racist, they actually have a lot in common with immigrant groups, especially when it comes to social values. If you look at stuff like trans stuff, you think it's a bunch of brown immigrants from South America that are championing. No, it's white kids, right? It's almost exclusively these like young white college kids that are non-binary and blue hair and all this shit. So this is like, again, this is conservatives creating their own problem and then getting super ass mad about it. But again, the idea that there's like this significant demographic change for people coming to this country, like, what are we going to do? Shut down all immigration? Like, is it even worse now than it was in the past? We got an issue with asylum seeking right now. We tried to fix it, but Republicans shut that bill down. So apparently they don't give a fuck about it too much, because they wanted to keep the issue open for Donald Trump to run on, so I guess they don't actually care. I have no sympathy, and Elon Musk is an idiot, so I wouldn't trust anything he says whatsoever about immigration or the border.
You said the idea demographic shift. You said I sort of don't buy into it. Do you mean the idea that it's happening or the idea that it's bad?
The idea that it's happening in like some unprecedented rate, the idea that it's even necessarily a bad thing, and the idea that it can't be like politically accounted for. There is no reason why brown people or black people or people of color coming from other countries have to vote Democrat and can't vote Republican. Right? Like, Republicans are the ones that say over and over again, Trump is doing better with black voters than anyone else. Okay, well, keep doing that then. Appeal to them. Why can you not appeal to people that aren't white, rural voter? You should be able to do this.
I quibble with what you said about, like, European immigrants, because, I mean, Europe has been having something of a perceivable shift to the right. It's quite hard to track because the elections keep surprising us. But I don't know, maybe like nationalists are more likely to stay at home because they're nationalists. Like
potentially, sure. But I mean, it still plays into my point. People aren't immigrating. White immigrants don't come from Europe to vote for conservatives in the United States.
Where there are immigrants immigrating into a country, of course, there could be so many reasons why they're voting left. Maybe it's just because they're all really reasonable people and left-wing parties are eminently more reasonable, and that's why immigrants are voting left on the whole. Do you not think it could possibly have something to do with them wanting to support their family? Coming over the border, something to do with, immigration welfare, this kind of stuff.
The United States sucks for welfare. We're a dog shit country when it comes to welfare. Like, people immigrate illegally to the United States usually because they're looking to work and they're looking for employment opportunities. I think we need an immigration overhaul, but nobody wants to sit down and actually do it to make it easier to come in and out of the country, at the very least for like work visas, so people don't feel the need to illegally immigrate to the country. But people aren't like the idea. This is just it's the most fucking American thing in the world. I think that people are coming here to get our excellent fucking welfare benefits. It's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you obviously don't agree with Elon Musk, let's put it that way, but there's no cause for concern, like even a slither, the idea that there might be a sort of self-reinforcing policy in politics. That is, self-reinforcing in the sense that if we vote for these people, they bring in these people who vote for the same people, who bring in more of those people, ultimately culminating in this self-fulfilling sort of democratic.
I mean, I guess theoretically that can happen, but like that can happen in so many different ways, right? Like who's to say that when here would be an example. Like liberals, broadly speaking, support things like abortion. Aren't you aborting like most of your voter base? Like, isn't it generally minorities or people? You know, they always talk about the Black Holocaust as abortion. Aren't Black voters generally Democrat? So if we think that people are specifically choosing policies just to increase their voter base, why do Democrats support abortion? Right? That's an example of a policy that Republicans want to fight against as hard as possible that hurts them electorally. So I don't think that people are necessarily making, you know, the argument that we should allow in more immigrants because we know they're going to vote for us. And that can be a workaround or a thing that you do for immigration overhaul. Again, maybe you make it so that people can come in for work visas, but they can't vote because they're just, you know, on temporary visas. Or maybe the path to citizenship is, you know, 10 years out or something, or a little bit harder than just residency. I don't know. There are ways to counter that, but it can't be. It can't be that your country's the country's immigration policy should be centered around the well-being of the country. It can't be centered around your party being too fucking racist to appeal to a huge demographic of voters coming from other parts of the world. Fuck you, leave. Go somewhere else. If your idea of good immigration is we can't have too many people coming in that don't match our racist, you know, ideology, then fuck you. We're actively making ourselves worse. And we already have restrictions on immigration. Like, I think it's 7% per country is like the cap or something like that. It's not like we'll take like 50 million legal Mexican immigrants in one time.
Do you think immigration is too high?
Well, I don't even know what that means. And nobody that is even debating it knows what that means. Like, the problem is that when you get into these types of conversations, you really need to get in the weeds about what you're saying. Like, so for instance, what is immigration too high? Well, for what? It grows the economy because labor is one of the most productive and important inputs to your economy. So in that sense, our GDP grows and our economy grows. Fiscally, it tends to be pretty beneficial because immigrants tend to be young and they work as young people, right? They're not old and consuming a ton of healthcare like older people are. In terms of cost of housing, probably be negative. It's probably driving prices up a bit because wherever they go, there's going to be an increased demand for houses. In terms of opportunity for locals, depending on what the unemployment is, you could have immigrants that are competing with local workers. You know, tech workers complain about H-1B immigrants. Some poor people in the South will complain about competing with illegals for work. To say that it's necessarily all good or all bad, or even good or bad, it really depends particularly on the issue that you're talking about.
It was discussed in the VP debate recently, and housing came up as one example. But it was also said that more than 50% or around 50% of Americans support mass deportations.
I seriously doubt that.
Which kind of stunned me as a statistic. I don't know if it's true, but like, I mean, that would surprise you if it were true?
I don't think that's true. My guess is if I could dig into that poll or whatever it's citing, it probably says something like, would you be in favor of deporting every illegal with like a violent felony or felony conviction or whatever? In which case, even I would be in favor of that. Yeah, fuck you. If you're going to illegally immigrate in here and then commit a fucking felony, it's time to go. Yeah, of course.
I mean, do you think that there's a reasonable case to be made for the sort of broad idea that immigration is too high that isn't based on just like emotive, racist, right-wing like paranoia?
I don't know if I would say it's based on racist paranoia, but it is based on paranoia. Like we said earlier, it's an aesthetic, right? In terms of, or the presentation of reality is aesthetic. Shane Gillis does a funny bit, you know, where he's talking about Trump and everything, about how, you know, my dad in Pennsylvania is oddly concerned with the border, and he's very obsessed with illegal immigration. You know, like an illegal immigrant is going to walk up to Pennsylvania and threaten his job. You know, I could tell you right now there are 5 million illegals crossing the border yesterday, or I could tell you it was 5,000 last year. You would have no idea. You have no way to track that. You have no way to know that. It's hard to know where this even shows up in people's lives. Yeah, there was a good YouGov poll on like, how do you feel about the outlook of the economy and or how are you doing in the economy? And it was like, as soon as Trump was elected versus Biden, and then when Biden was reelected again, it flips completely. Where all of a sudden, like as soon as Trump was elected, like when the economy was starting to do good, it is doing good now, but when it was doing good, I think a couple of years ago, and the stock market started to shoot up, Trump said that the reason why was because people thought that he was going to get elected again. So now the stock market is up. Like it's people are totally untethered from reality.
Yeah, I see a lot of people. Do you have any thoughts about the relevance of demographic change? I mean, I constantly see statistics being thrown around about how like white people are going to become a minority by 2100 or whatever it may be. Again, same question. Do you think that this is just sort of racist paranoia, or do you think there's any legitimate concern in this?
I think that good people can be driven to legitimate concern, but I don't think there is true legitimate concern. Who cares? Like, this is a country that is founded on immigration. Right now, I said this when I was talking to Sam Harris, like I've been told for decades that immigrants that don't share my values are going to overwhelm my country and either do Sharia law or Hispanic law or whatever the fuck is going to come in and destroy our country. And right now, the biggest threat to democracy in the United States is largely white conservatives. They share less in line with me politically and in terms of American values than any immigrant that illegally jumped the fence to come over here and work. So, no, I don't think it's a true concern. In the United States, we're really good at integrating immigrants from different backgrounds. We do it exceptionally well. We should continue to do that.
Thinking about politics is hard. One thing that makes it a lot harder is the media bias that seeps into...
Oh my god, there's a lot. It's the same guy? No.
It's fascinating. I mean, I'm paying attention as the words are coming out of your mouth to how they are just sort of emerging, right?
Boo, boo.
And it's weird to think that, like, in a way, as far as my experience is concerned, you know, everything that I know of you and hearing of you and experiencing of you is just appearing in my brain.
Yeah.
There's just this. I open my eyes and there's just this image, and I open my ears and there are just these words. And there's a sense in which when I'm speaking right now, I'm not calculating every word that's coming out of my mouth. I'm not, thinking about every sentence. These words, where the hell are they coming from? They are just going. I didn't know I was about to say the word going. It just came out, right? And
you have no idea how you said it. And when you fail to say it, if you forget it for a moment and you struggle to find a word, or you say the wrong word, that too is mysterious. Your success is mysterious, and your failure is mysterious.
But it makes it so fascinating to think that my own words coming out of my mouth seem no more connected to this thing I'm calling me than the words that are coming out of your mouth, right? And I don't know if that's what people are talking about when they describe the so-called ego death, or the one with everything type attitude that people have with spiritual experiences, if it's got something to do with this sense of realizing that, in other words, I've always pictured it as when someone says, there's no difference between me and everyone else in the world. I've always imagined the kind of experience they're having is something like them implanting themselves in everybody else and taking the self and sort of extending it to be the world, whereas maybe it sort of goes in the other direction.
Yeah, it does. I mean, have you ever taken psychedelics?
I have, yeah.
What have you taken, and what was that like?
2CB, mushrooms, LSD once, and never enough to have, enough to have some crazy experiences, but nothing to the extent of ego death.
Right.
As in, I've never had an experience where I've come out thinking, oh, that's what it means that's what the death of the ego is. You know, I've come out thinking, that's what this means. I can understand why people talk in this way or that way, and you know, just perhaps the most transformative experience of my entire life. But I've never experienced an ego death.
Right. Yeah. So the way I would add the psychedelic experience to this map is that, and the reason why it can be incredibly useful but also misleading, is that with psychedelics, the one thing that's very important about them is that in all but the rarest cases, they're guaranteed to do something. Right?
Oh, yeah.
If you take the requisite dose, you're going to have a change in your experience. So it's not going to be no one comes away from 300 micrograms of LSD saying, well, nothing happened, right? I mean, there are actually some people who, for whatever reason, are just neurologically impervious to certain psychedelics. But in the general case, you're just not going to be bored. You're not. I mean, it could be terrifying, but something's going to happen, and it's going to happen right on schedule, right? And you can't say the same thing about meditation or yoga or fasting or any other discipline that someone's going to engage so as to perturb their consciousness. And that's why psychedelics have been so useful for people as a gateway to meditation or the contemplative life in some way, because it's the thing that proved to them that it was possible to have a very different experience of the world, assuming they had a positive experience on psychedelics. What's misleading about it is it gives you the sense that spiritual expansion and progress is a matter of changing the contents of consciousness, a matter of having more mind and more esoteric states of mind, and to see brighter colors and to see different things with your eyes closed, right? Like now my eyes are closed, I don't see much of anything, but on mushrooms, wow, it was like an Aztec empire, and it was just I felt like I was could psychically travel to different places, and it's like that must be where spiritual progress lies. What's misleading about that is that we know that any experience you have, any qualitative change in the contents of consciousness is by definition temporary, right? I mean, first you don't have it, and then you have it, and then you don't have it, right? Because that's the nature of any experience. It's like, drinking a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever. It doesn't matter how big the cup is. Eventually you drink it, and then you no longer have that tea or coffee. So sort of impermanence rules, right? And so you can't, so a transitory spiritual experience can't be the real bedrock that is the basis of, the deepest possible well-being, if such a thing is discoverable. The other thing is it's misleading with respect to the sense that it gives you a sense that freedom, real psychological freedom and transformation is elsewhere, right? Like there's ordinary consciousness where you feel like this sort of conventional sense of self in a physical world that's not self, and you're disposed to do things like check your email, or how you can drive a car, you're not stoned, and yet there's all kinds of things denied you in this sense. There's all kinds of things you can't notice. Mm-hmm. And then you drop acid or you take MDMA or whatever it is, and you have this sea change in the content of consciousness, and all of that seems, assuming you're having good changes and not, you're not pitched into psychosis, which is also available. It seems like that progress is just getting, is a matter of getting better, more expansive, more love-drenched, more, insightful, more meaning-drenched thoughts and emotions and intuition. What meditation does is show you, and again, meditation can mean many things, but is what I mean by meditation and what people should mean by meditation. It unhooks you. It's essentially orthogonal to that whole regime of changes, changes in the contents of consciousness, and it allows you to recognize something about consciousness itself that is present, whatever the contents, right? I mean, it could be the full explosiveness of changes of the peak of a psychedelic trip, or it could just be the most boring, ordinary mind that just it's just you looking at a cup on a table and nothing else, right? there's a thing to there are things you can notice about consciousness that cause the sense of self, the sense of subject-object separation, to drop out, right? So you can be so ordinary, just staring at a cup consciousness can be free of self, and extraordinary, there's just an ocean of color and energy and bliss, can be free of self. And that freedom, in some sense, equalizes those two states, right? It's not to say that there's not, that oceans of color and bliss have a lot going for them. I mean, it's fun, but it's great when they appear and it's fine when they disappear, right? Then nothing really is lost if you can find this thing that is what I would call non-duality. It's also, it could be called selflessness, it could be called emptiness. I mean, there's various framings in Buddhism and elsewhere. But it's different than the expectation you just described of getting more mind, right? Like of suddenly you're expanded beyond yourself into the rest of the stuff that until a moment ago seemed like it was not self, right? So now it's not just me in this skin suit. I'm over there looking through your eyes too, and I'm out there with the people and the animals who are not me, but now all of a sudden it's just one big mind. Kind of. I would imagine there's actually experiences that can seem that way. I don't, whether they're veridical or not is certainly debatable, but I think you can have that sense that you of unity with a larger totality, but that's not the crucial insight that is selflessness by in the meditative space. It's a much more ordinary and simple recognition that if you pay close enough attention, like just in hearing any sound, like you hear the sound of traffic or whatever it is, the default mode is to feel like you're the one hearing. There's a hearer, and then there's a thing heard, and there's this subject-object kind of divide that's getting bridged with this operation of hearing. But real concentration, or better yet, a real analysis of this sense of being a subject in the first place, can suddenly collapse that to what is clearly a more basic condition of just hearing. Like there's just this pure perception of hearing prior to the concept of self and thing heard, and there's freedom in that. I mean, there really is as you begin to rest in that more and more and recognize its implications psychologically, it does become the antidote to all kinds of ordinary psychological suffering that you all kinds of knots in yourself that you otherwise are trying to figure out how to untie. You're just thinking, well, why do I feel this way? How can I feel better? How can I be happier? Why am I so disappointed and regretful and anxious, etc.? The more you can fall back into this recognition that there's no center to this experience, it suddenly gives you a direct experience of equanimity in the midst of other, even classically unpleasant experiences, right? So you can be feeling significant physical pain, or you can be feeling nausea, or you can feel something that is. I'm not saying there's no reason to act on bad perceptions. I mean, you might have to go to the hospital, but the question is, how unhappy do you have to be at every step along the way as you're riding to the hospital or dealing with the uncertainty of what the diagnosis is, or whatever. Like there's this adventure that happens at the level of concepts and at the level of changes, which you can keep punctuating with a recognition of selflessness, and each recognition does actually reset you to a place of real tranquility in the midst of it, and it's a tranquility that is not.
I have to put my shirt, not my long sleeve, fucking off. And my fucking trousers too. Oh my god. Should have done it before.
dependent on any changes. It's not dependent on the next good thing happening. It's not dependent on the bad thing that's present going away. It really is. It really does, in a very paradoxical way, tend to equalize experience. And how this, I mean, I don't want to bring us back to the moral landscape, but it is somewhat confusing how this might relate to everything I've said about the moral landscape, because everything I say about the moral landscape suggests that there really are stark differences between experiences. It really matters that your hand not be on a hot stove. There may be more to the story given the requisite ways of being in touch with what it is like to just be, in each moment, rather than become in the next moment through thought and concept.
So there's no you, there's just the sounds, the sights, the thoughts that emerge. I guess
It's just experience, right? See, the conventional sense is you're having an experience, right? There's you, the subject, the ego, self. And it's important to specify what that is for most people, because it's not, I'm not saying that people are illusions. I'm not saying that you don't have a body. I'm saying, but people don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they're subjects that have bodies. I mean, they feel like passengers in their bodies for the most part. You feel like you're in a relationship to your body. When your body malfunctions, when you have a pain that you don't want, or you have some symptom of something that worries, some possible disease that worries you, you're a prisoner of the body, but you're an inner subject. You're a kind of homunculus with respect to your presumed sense of what you are, from the first person side. Now we know that makes no sense neurologically, right? I mean, you're either the whole body, or your whole central nervous system, if you want to demarcate it in some way, or you're just the part of your central nervous system that is conscious, right? Wherever consciousness stops in the body, well, then that's the boundary of what you are. But most people feel like they're a subject, very likely in their head, that is, in some sense, unchanging, right? Like it's not that you notice changes, but you're noticing those changes from the point of view of being this subject that's not reducible to those changes, right? Like you feel like I was tired a moment ago, but now I'm not tired. But then you notice the change. There's fatigue, and now that fatigue is gone. But the subject seems somehow untouched by those changes.
No.
But the subject does seem, therefore, not identical to experience, right? Like you're having the experience. You're enduring the experience. You're riding around in the middle of the experience, and that's the false point of view that's undercut through meditation.
But of course, when a thought arises in your head, that thought's not arising in my head, right? There's this first person center of consciousness to which that thought is happening. That's you and not me. If the self is an illusion, if the self doesn't exist, if there is no center there, then what is the thing that a thought like that can happen to, that makes it such that you can have the thought but I can't have your thought?
Yeah, well, so that's why I said that people aren't illusions in the same way. I mean, I guess there's some perspective by which you could say that people are illusions, but not for these purposes. It's not mysterious, from my point of view, it's not mysterious that I'm thinking my thoughts and not thinking your thoughts, right? Because my thoughts, the only place for my thoughts to appear is where they are appearing in this system, this organism that is me, and you've got your own organism over there, which is you, and you. So the fact that you have your memories and I have my memories is no more mysterious than saying, I just wrote something on my palm, and it's on my palm and not on your palm, right? Like this is just a physically instantiated thing about this system that is. It's like the pain in my knee is felt in my knee because it's a pain, and there's only one knee in the universe that feels that is giving rise to this particular pain.
Yeah.
And there's only one brain in the universe that is susceptible to those inputs. And so it is with my memories, and so it is with anything else that I might think. But the I part of it, the sense that it's me and mine from the point of view of a subject, that's when it becomes impersonal. That's when it becomes, because consciousness really is just the fact that anything is appearing at all. So in some sense, consciousness for me is the same as for you, whatever you're conscious of, because consciousness is just the condition in which there is a qualitative character to anything. Right? So I just view them, I view consciousness ultimately as deeply impersonal and in some sense transcendent. I mean, it's transcendent of the feeling of being a locus of consciousness in the head. Right? You can get rid of that feeling. You can inspect that feeling such that it disappears, and what you have is a totality of appearances that includes all of your experience. It's not like your experience suddenly changes radically, but there's no center to it. You're not on the edge of it. You're not separate from it. There's just it, right? And that there's a freedom in that, because you're no longer, I mean, the sense of self is a kind of contraction. It's a perpetual mode of reacting to experience. So it is born of this perpetual, I like this, I don't like that, I like this, I don't like that, more, less, and you're constantly gripping the deliverances of your five senses and your mind, right? You're feeling, you're cognitively, you're trying to figure things out. You feel doubt. Doubt is a kind of emotion, right? And and I would argue it's a negatively valenced one. Uncertainty is like that, and you're constantly working in every channel in which you're available, and all of it implies a center, and that's the feeling of being a subject. When you look for that center and fail to find it, all of your capacities are still available to you. You can still hear and smell and think, but it's not. It's like the difference between having an open hand versus having a clenched fist. I mean, you can sort of clench your fist enough. If this is the only way you've ever had a hand, well, you might even think there's something in the middle of it, right? You might think there's a structure here, but it's an implied structure. Like if you just open your hand, you realize there's nothing in there, however it felt, and nothing else need change. It's just that there's a source of confusion and discomfort that is no longer there, and then it remains to be seen just how good it is for alleviating other psychological problems or sources of suffering, or what is it good for is an open question as you live your life with this capacity. But not having the capacity and it being in doubt about it is just a blocker for exploring it, right? You just then can't, it's like being in doubt as to whether or not, it's possible to, whatever it is, get in shape, because like the gym hasn't been invented, no one's ever figured out that just arbitrarily lifting heavy objects will change your body, and the first time someone does it and describes it, it seems totally pointless. I mean, you mean to say that with all the things you could be doing in life, you're just going over there and picking up heavy objects and putting them down to the point of discomfort, and sometimes getting injured, and you're saying this is actually good, and if you couldn't see the changes in people's bodies, if you couldn't put a photo of Arnold Schwarzenegger on the wall of the gym to show that something radically different is possible, well, then everyone would be we'd be 200 years into this project and still be talking about our doubts about whether or not there's a there, right? And it's just a inconvenient fact that certain changes are not visually easy to see, and that's that's a problem.
Well, I think I'm no longer a meditation skeptic, at least to the degree that I think I'll be giving it a proper go. I mean, when I say I've never meditated, I'll have closed my eyes and thought, as you put it before, where people have encouraged me to meditate and I've sort of gone along with it. But I think a conversation like this is something like the equivalent of putting that picture on the wall of the gym, where you begin to sort of paint a picture of what things can look like to a brain that reflects on these things deeply.
Well, I'll add one more piece to you, for you, which is it's kind of a logical handhold that I think it should work. It's even if you were in doubt about, so the claim I'm making is that the feeling of self is vulnerable to inspection, right? If you look closely enough at it, you'll see that consciousness is a prior fact about you that doesn't actually conform to this feeling of I or me, right? Or subjectivity. And there's one way you can see that logically, which is if feeling like I or me feels like something, that itself must be an appearance in consciousness. I mean, that there's something you're noticing about your experience that feels that way, right? And there's in the same way that you're noticing my voice as an object, it's just an appearance. The fact that you're outside my voice, being able to notice it, proves that you're not reducible to it, right? And so it is with sensations in your body. Like the pain in your knee is not you because you're over here noticing it down there, right? If this feeling of self feels like anything, if there's any signature energetically, if it's on your face or in your chest or somewhere where you might intuit it, there's this prior condition of just the light by which it's being seen. So what's that feel like? Right? And so that's anyway, that's just a concept, but that's a pointer into why it would make sense that this would be available.
Thinking about the big questions in life can take a heavy toll on our mental health. I've certainly experienced existential anxiety before.
Oh, really? All right. Oh, that was good. Well, not really. Oh shit. It's not too easy to read. I'm done. I cannot. I must add something here. It's too broad. Maybe a small saw, or maybe even just this thing, because this is insane. It looks ugly. It looks fucking ugly. It won't do. Can I do like... What if I do this? No, that won't work either. Well, what I could actually do is make this type of structure, I believe. Also, I believe we like this. Yeah, making this type of structure. Or will it actually work? Well, if I could... Wait a second, if I could do this... No. If I could do this... Well, that's... Maybe that is not too tight. Maybe that isn't. Now I only have to make this type of structure. Right? Yeah, I would need to copy that. So if I just... So that's what it's made of. So what if I copy this? And make it as an object. I copy it. I press this. I probably also do this. Yeah, here. I move it like that. Yeah, that's good. But before I move this up, This one, is that already a solid object? No, it's not. I will make it a solid object. I'll put it up. For the time being, I will take this. I will put it down like this. Or will it actually work? Because that's the pattern. Well, if I make it like this, then is it sufficiently tight? I think yeah. Actually yeah, and if I also take, oh my god, if I also take this, make it a single object, do it this way, then I think that works just fine. Then I should press it here. Now what I can do is I will need, oops, will I? I think we lack, wait a minute. Do we lack that? Oops. Yes, we do lack that. This is just black thingy filler. So we go here. Where do we have black thingy? This is a small black thingy. It's not even black. So we'll have to take, here's, that's where it is. Yes, we don't have any. We take it, make it black, and now just, it might not need one, or maybe it might. I will have to check. Alright, now we have that, those black thingies. Oh wait, they actually don't fucking change anything. Well, maybe when the background is animated or something like that. Maybe. So, but now we have it. But now there's still a problem. Maybe now it is possible to put something like this. Oops. Maybe now this will work. I'm not sure. Not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure that's gonna work. That does not look too well. Well, but to be honest, you don't really need anything here if you have this placed. But that does not look too nice. That's the problem we're dealing with here. Can anything be done to avoid this? And we'll also have to add this here to cover these. And if that's the case, I actually wanted to check if I can do anything here, but it's probably too fucking late. My hand is not warmed up anymore, and I must turn this off. I need CPS counter. was not too bad, but not 6 CPS, that's not fast enough. I just cannot remember the way you press the keyboard. There are so many nuances, you cannot really comprehend all of them, like every click of the first third line section, the yell, all of them you make in a specific manner. You have to tilt your finger differently for each click, and the speed which you tilt your finger with, and all that. Even when I can replicate the correct pattern for the first little straight line section, I cannot really help myself further on. You tilt your wrist to the left and the first section, and to the right and the second. How is that fucking possible to do? But that's the way to go. Or can you? Or do you have to tilt it to the right? That was a fluke. I was not using my wrist enough. Fuck. That was not too bad. I'll have to rest if I want to show anything. That was, I don't know, another flick. 47 call. Wasting my time, I don't know. Feel like wasting my time. Wait, there must be comments. There might not be too interesting. Oh. My weak hand, so weak. So fuck my fucking voice. So weak. come I'm not pressing the fucking keyboard hard enough? I need version, fucking wave version. What? 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 Why? Would have helped me a lot. That makes it more consistent if I tilt my hand to the right. You just saw that. You just saw that. I wonder why. But it makes lots of other things despicable. My stamina gets much worse. Useless. But I still feel like I can get somewhere. That feeling is so illusionary. And dumb and stupid and useless and pointless. Pain. What time is it? 3:17. Fuck me. It still does not fucking work. Stop flying up. That's not fair. Again. Stop. My God. Using yours definitely helps. Just as I have discovered yesterday. It's still so fucking hard because of the first section. First section that starts with fucking microclicks that are very hard to do with your wrist. Wanna get humiliated again. I was raping my hand on purpose. Alright, I wanna die. Goodbye, guys.